My name is Kang Jun-ho, and in a kingdom where magic decides everything, I was the teacher everyone agreed was worthless. 29 years old, 9 years at the Royal Magic Academy, and not a single student of mine had ever passed the ranking exam. The headmaster said it plain, in front of the whole staff room. Worthless, Headmaster Vale said, and he didn't even raise his voice. 9 years, Jun-ho. 9 years, and every student you touched either failed or ran. The academy cannot afford your kind of compassion. He slid my dismissal papers across the desk like he was stamping a package for the wrong address. I wanted to argue. I'd taught the ones no one else would take. The too weak, the too broken, the too different. But arguing with Vale was like arguing with the tide. The other teachers looked away. Not one of them met my eyes. I picked up the papers and walked out. The academy halls had never felt this long. I passed the practice yards where noble students drilled with tutors I couldn't afford, and the library where I'd read until my eyes burned, trying to close the gap between what I knew and what I needed to know. 9 years, and it all ended at the East Gate. The gatekeeper, old Han, was the only one who said anything. "You taught my granddaughter," he said quietly, and pressed a warm bun into my hand. She never forgot. Said you were the first teacher who didn't call her stupid. I took the bun. I didn't trust my voice to answer. Outside the gate, the city went on without me. Carriages, merchants, students in crisp uniforms who didn't know my name. I stood there with a single bag and a warm bun, and 29 years of knowing I'd done the right thing, and nothing to show for it but the cold. The room I rented was above a fishmonger's, and it smelled like it. I sat on the thin mattress and counted what I had. 12,480 won of debt, a worn robe, and a stack of lesson plans no academy would ever look at again. Rent was due in 3 days. I'd spent my whole life believing that if you taught well enough, the world would notice. It doesn't work that way. The world notices rank and money and the names of noble houses. A broke teacher with no students and a failing record has exactly one job: keep his head down and disappear. That was the night I almost gave up. I sat in the dark and thought about the students who'd failed and wondered if Vale was right, if my compassion really had been the thing holding them back. The truth sat in my chest like a stone. Temporary had lasted 9 years, and it wasn't temporary. It was just my life. That's when it appeared. A panel of royal violet light floating over my chest, clean and still as a held breath. Academy system activated. I blinked, and it didn't go away. I reached for it, and it rippled like water and stayed. The Academy system teaches through real instruction, it read, and I read it 3 times in the dark of that fish-smelling room. Every lesson the instructor genuinely imparts becomes true growth for the student. It amplifies real learning. It never fabricates talent. I almost laughed. A system that promised to make me a better teacher, me, the worthless one? But then I read the fine print, and my stomach dropped. It could only teach what I truly understood. My own knowledge was the ceiling. Every gap in my head was a gap I couldn't close in my students. The rules were laid out like a contract, and I read them like one. The system paid for verified mastery only. A skill actually performed, a lesson actually demonstrated. No talent appeared from nothing. A lazy student would get nothing. A lying teacher would get nothing. I understood the catch the way only a broke man can. This wasn't a cheat. It was the opposite of a cheat. It was everything I'd already believed, made real. Teaching was real work, and learning was real work, and the system just made that work count. And there, at the bottom, in smaller text, the instructor's knowledge is finite. Keep learning, or the system withholds the lesson. I looked at my worn book and my stack of failed lesson plans, and for the first time in 9 years, I felt the shape of a way forward. I found her 2 days later in the alley behind the West Market, a girl in a torn academy uniform, silver-white hair dull with dust, sitting against a wall like she'd been thrown there. Seo Ye-rin. I'd heard the name, a noble daughter whose magic core had shattered. Her house had discarded her for it. Useless, they'd said, and a shattered core meant she'd never cast again, which meant she'd never be worth a dowry or a title. She was 19 years old, and the academy had crossed her name off its rolls without a second thought. "Go away," she said when she saw me. Not angry, just tired, the way people are when they've already heard every version of no. I sat down on the crate across from her and opened my mouth, and what came out wasn't a speech, it was the truth. I was fired, I told her. Worthless, they called me. Every student I ever took on failed or ran. She looked up, and for the first time something moved in her eyes. It wasn't hope, it was recognition. One discarded person sizing up another. Your core isn't shattered, I said, and I believed it, even though I couldn't prove it yet. The system had shown me the shape of what was wrong with her, the way a good teacher sees what a broken student could be. It's overfull. You're holding too much. No one ever taught you to channel it. She stared at me for a long time. And you think you can? She said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a test. I'd spent 9 years failing students, and here was the one question I'd never stopped asking myself. Could I actually teach the ones everyone else threw away? Yes, I said, but only if you do the work. We worked in the back room of the fishmonger's shop, because I couldn't afford anywhere else, and she wouldn't go back to the academy. She sat cross-legged on the floor, and I taught her to breathe, not the noble way she'd been taught, but the slow way, the way that lets an overfull core drain instead of burst. The system paid for it. Lessons, 1. Students, 1, the panel read, and I watched the numbers tick and felt something I hadn't felt in 9 years. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet certainty that the work mattered and that the work was real. It drained me. My mana, my focus, the last of my strength. Teaching a shattered core to channel is like carrying water uphill in your bare hands. But Ye-Rin's breathing evened out, and the dust seemed to settle off her, and when she opened her eyes, there was the faintest violet light behind them. Your core isn't broken, I told her again, and this time I could prove it. It's overfull. You've been drowning in your own mana because no one ever showed you the outlet. She laughed, once, and it is the first real sound I'd heard her make. My family called me a failure for 19 years. The "so what" came the next morning, the way it always does when a discarded girl starts to glow. A neighbor had seen the light from our window and talked, and by noon, the market was whispering that the shattered noble was casting again. Vale's Academy had ears everywhere, and I knew it wouldn't be long before they came looking. Ye-Rin stood in the doorway of the fish shop and looked out at the city that had thrown her away. I'm not going back, she said. Not to her house, not to the academy, but I'll be your student. She turned to face me, and there was something steady in her now. Teach me, Jun-ho, all of it. Far across the city, Headmaster Vale was hearing the same rumor from a different mouth. The worthless teacher, they said, had taken in the shattered noble, and the shattered noble was glowing again. Vale set down his wine and smiled the thin smile of a man who sees a problem he can squash. 2 discards, he said to the empty room, don't make a class. He was right, and he wasn't. 2 discards make the beginning of a class, but the system was already ticking in the corner of my eye, patient and quiet, and it had one more number it was waiting to show me. I didn't know it yet, standing in that fish-smelling back room with my first student, but this was the first brick of something that would terrify the whole academy. Lessons, 3. Students, 1. Reputation, 2. It wasn't much, it was everything. She was at the fishmonger's door before the sun was fully up. Seo Ye-Rin, the noble daughter, standing in the cold with her arms crossed and her chin up, like she decided being early was the only thing left in her control. You're late, she said, and I wasn't. She'd just been earlier. The fishmonger, a round woman named Mrs. Day, watched us from the doorway and said nothing. She'd started renting me the back room for a handful of won a day, half pity and half hope that I'd stop looking like a man about to drown. I lit the candle and told Ye-Rin to sit. We had no classroom, no desks, no board. We had a cleared floor, a crate of chalk, and the one thing no one had ever given her, time, and a teacher who wasn't going to call her broken. I rolled up my sleeves. Lesson 1, I said, breathe. The first thing I taught her was what I knew cold, the slow channeling breath, the way you let an overfull core bleed pressure instead of burst. But the second thing I tried to teach her, the structured casting forms, tripped on the edge of my own ignorance, and I felt it. The system's fine print, sharp as a splinter. The instructor's knowledge is finite, the panel had said. It turned out that meant exactly what it said. The moment I reached the edge of what I actually understood, the lesson stalled. The system wouldn't let me teach what I didn't know, and I couldn't fake a demonstration my own hands had never performed. So I did what a real teacher does when he hits the wall. I admitted it. I need to study, I told her, and I didn't pretend otherwise. She stared at me, and something in her face shifted. Not disappointment, relief. A teacher who didn't know everything was, to her, the first honest one she'd ever met. The academy library was off limits to a fired teacher, but the back door wasn't. Librarian Mira found me in the restricted stacks at midnight with 3 books under my coat and didn't call the guard. Instead, she took one look at me and said, "So it's true. You're teaching the CO girl." "Her name is Ye Rin," I said. Mira was quiet for a moment, then reached past me and pulled down a 4th book, a thin, worn text on core pressure theory that wasn't on any shelf I was allowed near. "Your grandfather's students," she said, "used to return this one late. I owe the name." I didn't know my grandfather had taught at the academy. I didn't know a lot of things, but I left the library that night with 4 books I hadn't paid for and one thing I hadn't had in 9 years. The feeling that someone, somewhere, was on my side. Money had to come from somewhere, because rent didn't care about principle. The answer walked in the next afternoon in the shape of Merchant Dole, a stout man with a coin pouch at his belt and an apprentice who couldn't light a candle to save his life. "I hear you take the ones no one else will," Dole said. "My nephew's hopeless. Teach him, and I'll pay." So I had 2 students now, a shattered noble and a merchant's nephew who flinched every time his own mana sparked. I taught them side by side on that cleared floor, and the system paid for both, because the teaching was real and the learning was real, and I wasn't faking a single demonstration. Instructor Saran walked past the open door and stopped, just long enough to look in and laugh. "A fishmonger's classroom," he said, loud enough for the whole street. "How fitting for the worthless teacher." Then he kept walking, and I kept teaching, because the only answer to a man like that is a student who proves him wrong. The real work was Ye Rin. Her core wasn't shattered. It was over full, 19 years of mana with no outlet, and the pressure was slowly killing her. The slow breath let it bleed off. The structured forms gave it somewhere to go. But she'd been taught her whole life to clamp down, to contain, and unlearning that was the whole war. We drilled until her hands shook. I had her practice the outlet form 100 times, not because I wanted 100, but because the 100th is where the body stops fighting itself and starts remembering. "Again," I said, "again," and she did, every time, jaw set, violet light flickering at her fingertips. The system ticked as she worked. Lessons, 5. It didn't inflate the numbers because she was noble or pitiable or pretty. It paid for verified mastery only, a form actually performed, a skill actually demonstrated. That was the whole magic and the whole point. But every lesson cost me, not money, mana. The system drew on the instructor, and teaching a 19-year-old noble to channel an overfull core is like holding a dam open with your bare hands while the river runs through you. By the time the candle burned low, I couldn't feel my fingertips. I hid it. I smiled and told her she was doing well and sent her home with a meal I couldn't really afford. Then I sat down hard against the wall and let the shaking take me, and I understood the system's second truth. A teacher who pours himself out every day doesn't get to be inexhaustible. He gets to be tired. That's the cost nobody sees. The system didn't conjure talent out of nothing. It converted my strength into hers, lesson by lesson. If I taught too hard without resting, I'd burn out, and then there'd be no lessons for anyone. So I learned to ration myself, the way a broke man rations candlelight. It came 3 days later, in the middle of a lesson neither of us thought would be the one. Ye Rin was working the outlet form, her brow furrowed, and then, clean and steady as a held breath, a single thread of violet mana ran from her palm to her elbow and stayed. No flare, no burst. Control. She stared at her own hand like she'd never seen it before. 19 years of being told she was broken, and there it was. A thread of mana, smooth as silk, exactly where she'd always been told nothing would ever grow. "Again," I said, and my voice cracked. "Do it again, so I know it wasn't luck." She did. 3 times, then 5, then 10. The system read it the way a good examiner should. Verified mastery, no inflation, no pity. Class rank, E. And in that cramped back room that smelled of fish, the discarded noble and the worthless teacher both stood a little straighter. The so what came that evening, the way it always does. A thread of controlled mana means a spell, and the simplest spell is light. Yerin held her palm out, and a small, steady violet flame bloomed above it. The first thing she'd ever cast that didn't hurt her. The first thing she'd ever cast on purpose. Mrs. Day saw it through the crack in the door and crossed herself, then brought us both soup she claimed was leftover. The whole street was starting to understand what was happening in that back room, and a woman who glows in the dark is worth a lot more to the neighborhood than a rumor. But light in a slum is also a signal. I watched the flame and thought about the ranking exam in a month, and about Vale's Academy with its ears everywhere, and about what happens when a discarded girl stops being easy to ignore. Progress has a shadow, and I'd been teaching long enough to know it. Siron cornered us at the well the next morning, in front of half the market. "Word is the shattered noble's casting again," he said, loud enough to carry. "A trick of the light, more like. Or maybe the worthless teachers finally started lying to keep his only student from walking." Yerin opened her mouth, and I stopped her with a look. Some fights you win with a demonstration, not an argument. She understood, and instead of snapping back, she lifted her hand and let the violet thread run from palm to elbow, calm as you please, while the market went quiet around us. Saran's smile thinned, but didn't break. "The ranking exam will settle it," he said, and turned away. But I'd seen the flash of something under the contempt. Not fear exactly. The dawning knowledge that the students his academy threw away were starting to glow, and that people were starting to watch. That night, I sat with the ledger, because a teacher who doesn't count his money is a teacher who doesn't teach next month. Dole's payment had come through, and the debt that had felt like a stone in my chest was a little smaller than it had been. Funds, negative $10,340. Still a hole, but a hole with walls now. Reputation, 5. The market knew our names. Lessons, 7. The panel was quiet in the corner of my eye, patient, waiting. I closed the ledger and looked at the books Mira had given me, and at the lesson plans I'd rewritten 3 times, and I understood the shape of the road ahead. It would be grinding, and it would cost me, and every step up would come with a fresh problem. That was the system's whole design, but the ranking exam was 4 weeks away, and I had a student who could hold a thread of mana, and for the first time in 9 years, I let myself think the word, possible. The outlet form was working, but only just. Yerin's core had 19 years of pressure stored behind a wall her family had told her to keep sealed, and now that the wall had a crack in it, everything behind it wanted out at once. The slow breath bled it off. Some days, the slow breath wasn't enough. I could see it in the way her light flickered. Not the clean thread anymore, but a jagged stutter, like a candle in a draft. She didn't complain. She just worked harder, jaw tight, and that was the problem. A noble daughter learns to hide pain the way other people learn to breathe. "Stop," I told her. "You're forcing it. Forcing an overfull core is how you get the burst you've been afraid of your whole life." She looked at me, and for a second the proud mask slipped, and I saw the thing underneath. A girl who'd been holding a dam closed by herself for 19 years and was tired. That night, I read Mira's book until the candle guttered. Core Pressure Theory, it was called, and it was my grandfather's margin notes in the corners, cramped and patient. The book said an overfull core could be released safely, but only through a controlled shock, a single deliberate rupture at the right moment, from the outside. The margin notes were the real gold. My grandfather had done this before. He'd written the exact pressure threshold, the exact form, and under it, in a shakier hand than the rest, "Never on a student you are not willing to carry if it goes wrong." I read that line 10 times. I closed the book and sat in the dark and did the arithmetic of risk. If I got it wrong, I could do what her family feared and shatter the core for real. If I did nothing, the pressure would keep building until it broke her on its own. Teaching is a series of impossible choices, and this was the first one that could kill her. I told her the truth in the morning, all of it. The pressure, the threshold, the risk. "There's a way to release it safely," I said. "A controlled rupture, but it has to be timed perfectly, and if I'm wrong, your core could shatter the way everyone always said it already had." She listened without flinching. Then she asked the question I should have known she'd ask. "And if we do nothing?" I didn't lie to her. The pressure builds until it breaks on its own, probably within a month, probably worse than if I did it. The silence in the back room was complete. "Then do it," she said. "Just that. No trembling, no bargaining. I've spent 19 years waiting for my own body to betray me. I'd rather it happen in your hands than alone in an alley." And that, I understood later, was the first time she'd ever trusted anyone with her life. We prepared for 3 days. I made her do the slow breath until it was muscle memory, and I practiced the release form on myself until my hands knew the shape of it. Mrs. Day barred the front door without being asked and posted herself outside it like a guard at a gate. On the third evening, Ye-rin sat cross-legged in the center of the cleared floor, and I sat across from her. The panel glowed in the corner of my eye, steady. I'd never been more aware of my own heartbeat. "When I tell you to let go," I said, "you let go of everything. Do you trust me?" "Yes," she said. And the wild thing was, she meant it. The girl who'd heard no from every door in the kingdom, who'd been thrown away by her own house, looked at me with calm eyes and put 19 years of her life into my hands. I took a breath. Then we begin. What happened next took 3 heartbeats and felt like a year. I shaped the release form and pressed it against the wall of her core, and at the exact moment the pressure peaked, I told her to let go, and she did. The violet mana came out of her like a held breath finally released. Not a blast, but a wave, and I guided it out and down and into the ground. The floorboards shook, the candle blew out, and then silence, and Ye-rin still upright, her hair settling back around her shoulders, and the light in her palms steady for the first time since I'd met her. Steady, not stuttering. The pressure that had been killing her was gone. Lessons 12, the panel read. Students 1. It wasn't a reward, it was a record, a real lesson, really taught, really learned, at real risk, and the system logged it because it was true. I reached out and caught her as she swayed, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. The light had spilled out under the door, and Mrs. Day had seen it, and Mrs. Day was not a woman who kept quiet. By the time I helped Ye-rin to her feet, there were faces at the windows and a murmur running up and down the street like a spark along a fuse. She walked out the front door on her own 2 feet and lifted one hand, and a perfect violet flame bloomed above her palm, smooth, controlled, unmistakable. The market went dead quiet. Then someone started to clap, and someone else, and the sound rolled down the street like a verdict. A month ago, this girl had been sitting in an alley, waiting to be forgotten. Now a whole street was watching her glow. I stood behind her and let her have it, because that was the point of everything I'd ever believed. The students everyone threw away weren't broken. They were just waiting for someone to look. The so what didn't wait for morning. By the next day, the story was all over the West Market, and it had grown Keith in the telling. The shattered noble wasn't shattered. The worthless teacher had fixed her, and the academy that threw her away had thrown away a treasure. I heard 3 different versions before noon. It changed things on the ground. Dahl came back with 2 more apprentices and paid double without being asked. A baker left bread at the door. A weaver offered to mend Ye-rin's torn uniform for free. Reputation, I was learning, is a kind of currency too, and a street that believes in you will feed you while you climb. But every coin has a shadow. The story that reached the cheap stalls reached the marble halls too, and the marble halls did not like what they heard. A discarded girl casting clean mana wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a challenge, and challenges are answered. He came the next morning, a servant in the blue and silver livery of House Seo, and he didn't knock. He stood in the doorway with a sealed letter and looked past me to Ye-rin like she was an object that had been mislaid. "A summons," he said, "from the Lord of House Seo. Your father requires your presence." Ye-rin went very still. I watched the color drain from her face and then come back hard. "My father," she said slowly, "requires nothing of me. He discarded me. I am no longer a daughter of House Seo." The servant's lip curled, but he held out the letter and waited. "Tell your lord," Ye-rin said, and her voice didn't shake, "that the shattered noble he threw away is whole now, and she is not coming back." The servant left with the letter unopened, and I watched him go and thought, that was the real test, and she just passed it. But the house would not. When we were alone, she didn't break down the way I'd half expected. She stood at the window and looked out at the city and said, "Quiet." I was 8 years old the first time my father called me a failure. It was the first thing I ever learned about myself. It took 19 years to learn he was wrong. "You did that," I said. "Not me. I just showed you how to breathe." She turned and looked at me, and there was something new in her face. Not the guarded pride, not the brokenness, a kind of clear, hard calm. "Then teach me the rest," she said, "so I never have to go back." I nodded, and I meant it. But I also knew what she'd just done. She'd refused the most powerful house in the West Quarter, and the ranking exam was 3 weeks away, and everything she'd just won was about to be tested by people who did not intend to lose. I counted it all out that night. Class rank, D. Reputation, 11. Funds, minus $8,410. The debt was still a hole, but a smaller one, and there was bread on the table and a second apprentice to teach, and a noble daughter who could hold a flame steady in her hand. The panel sat in the corner of my eye and offered no congratulations. It never did. It just logged the truth, and the truth was that we'd climbed one rung of a very long ladder, and the people at the top had already noticed. House Seo's summons sat unanswered on the crate like a drawn sword. I looked at my grandfather's book and his cramped patient notes, and I wondered what else I didn't know. About my grandfather, about teaching, about the academy that had thrown us both away. Then I blew out the candle and slept, because the exam was coming and we were not ready yet. End of chapter 3. The ranking exam was held in the Great Hall, and it was the first time in a month I'd walked through the academy gates. The clerk at the registration desk looked at Ye-rin's name, then at her mended commoner's clothes, and said, "The CO girl. I thought she'd been crossed off." "Uncross her," I said, and slid the fee across the desk, most of what I'd saved, and worth every coin for the look on his face. Ye-rin stood beside me with her chin up, and the students in their crisp uniforms parted around us like we carried something contagious. Kale Arden was the first name on the board, as always, his scores printed in gold. He swept past us without a glance, flanked by 2 of the headmaster's attendants, and the crowd whispered his name like a title, the Academy's shining star. I watched him go and felt the old, cold weight of it. Rank here wasn't earned, it was inherited. Examiner Beck read the rules in a thin, officious voice, and I watched him, because a man's hands tell you more than his mouth. He kept one finger on the ledger, and every time a commoner's name came up, that finger tapped twice. Twice. I'd seen enough rigged exams in 9 years to know the rhythm. The first trial was a mana lattice. You built a standing structure of pure mana, and it was scored on stability. It was also, I knew, the trial most easily graded down. A noble's lattice wobbling was promising. A commoner's lattice wobbling was failed. The line between them was Bake's finger on the ledger. I found Ye-rin before her turn. "They're going to underscore you," I told her. "Don't argue, don't flare. Just build it so clean that no one can look away, and let the room see the score they try to give it." She nodded, and something cold and certain settled into her eyes. Kale went first, of course. He built a lattice so clean it caught the light like cut glass, a tower of interlocking mana that didn't so much as tremble, and the hall erupted the way a hall erupts for a thing it has seen 100 times and still can't believe. Bake's finger didn't tap. Kale's score was already written. I watched him and did the arithmetic a teacher does. His mana control was real, not just inherited, but drilled, thousands of hours of it. The system could match that, given time, because real work is real work. But time was the thing we didn't have, and he'd had 19 years of it. When he stepped down, his eyes met mine for a single second, and I saw it. Not contempt, not even interest. The flat recognition of a man who has never had to look at the people beneath him, filing me away as nothing. Fine, let him. Nothing is the best place to build a surprise. Ye-rin walked to the center of the floor, and the whispering started. That's her, the shattered one. The one the fishmonger's teacher fixed. She didn't look at them. She just raised her hands and began to build, and the violet mana came when she called it, clean and steady as the breath I'd taught her. Her lattice rose, and it didn't wobble. It climbed in interlocking arcs, tighter than anything a month of training should have produced, and the room's whispering died. I watched Bake's finger hover over the ledger and tap. Twice, 3 times, and I saw his mouth tighten when he couldn't find the flaw he was looking for. The score he read out was a full grade below what the lattice deserved, and the crowd knew it. A murmur went through the stands. But Ye-rin just lowered her hands and walked back to me, calm, and said under her breath, "Let the room see." And it had. I followed Beck after the first trial, because a rigged exam has paper trails, and a man who's being paid off gets careless. He slipped into a side room with his ledger, and through the cracked door I watched him take a small pouch from a noble steward and make a mark against a name. Then another. Then another. The names were all commoners. The pouch was house coin. I knew the seal, the same blue and silver as the summons Ye-rin had refused. So House Seo was paying to keep the discards down, buying the ranking the way you buy a horse. I stood in that hallway and felt 9 years of anger find its shape. I didn't have proof I could carry. A pouch seen through a crack is a rumor, not evidence. But I had my grandfather's books, and I had a student who could build a lattice a man couldn't look away from, and I had the beginnings of a plan that was going to need more than one exam to finish. The second trial was the one that mattered. A live casting, unassisted, in front of the full stands. Ye-rin stepped up, and this time, the room was watching her the way you watch a thing you've been told is broken but can't stop looking at. She raised her hand, and she cast. The flame came clean and bright, and then, because she'd been listening, because she drilled it 100 times, she shaped it. A thread became a ring, the ring became a lattice in the air, steady and spinning, and it held. The room forgot to breathe. Somewhere in the stands, someone started to clap before the score. Bake read her score, and this time, the crowd wouldn't let him get away with it. The murmur became a shout, and the shout became a demand. And I saw, for the first time in 9 years, a rigged examiner's hand shake. You can't underscore a thing 1,000 people just watched. That was the lesson, and they'd all just learned it. The final board went up, and the room surged toward it. Kale's name was first, gold as always, but Ye-rin's name had climbed. Class rank, C. Not the top, not even close, but a discarded girl who'd been crossed off the rolls a month ago had just climbed 3 ranks in a single exam, in front of the whole academy. I found her at the edge of the crowd, staring at her own name like it was a stranger's. C rank, she said, and her voice was strange. He underscored me, and it still wasn't enough to keep me down. I looked at the board and then at her. That's the part they can't buy, I said. Real work. Lessons, 19. The panel logged it, quiet and certain. Every form I'd taught her, every 100 repetitions, every breath. It had all been real, and it had all counted, and no pouch of house coin could take it back. In the corner of the board, Kale Arden's name sat at the top, and for the first time, I saw him glance at us. The so what came before we reached the gate. A C-rank discard student was a story, and the story was already running ahead of us. The fishmonger's teacher had turned the shattered noble into a C-rank in a month. It was the kind of story that moves money and makes enemies in equal measure. A steward from a minor house stopped us and offered Ye-rin a stipend to study under their name. Another asked if I took commissions. The machinery of the kingdom, I was learning, has no loyalty, only a nose for rising value. We'd climbed 3 ranks, and suddenly the discards had a market price. But the shadow was already there too. I caught Bake watching us from the steps, his ledger clutched to his chest, and his face was the face of a man who'd just been made to look foolish in public. The exam had been the test. What came after would be the cost. They stopped us at the gate, Bake and Saron together, which told me the message came from higher than both of them. You should be careful, Saron said, pleasant as poison. The academy has a way of handling teachers who embarrass it, and students who outgrow their station. My station, Ye-rin said, is C rank. Earned in public in front of 1,000 witnesses. It was the first time I'd heard her answer back to one of them, and it landed. Saron's smile didn't so much as twitch, but his eyes did, and that was enough. Bake just watched, and I watched him back. Tell Vale, I said quietly, that his examiner's finger taps twice on every commoner's name. Tell him I've been counting. Neither of them answered. They turned and walked back through the gate, and I knew the first real move of the game had just been made. I sat up late and did the accounts. Funds, negative $5,260. The fee and the books and the food had all come from somewhere, and the somewhere was thinner than I liked. But a C-rank student drew paying peoples the way a flame draws moths. For the first time, the ledger had 2 columns worth looking at. Reputation, 19. Class rank, C. Lessons, 19. The panel was quiet. I looked at the numbers and then out the window at the Academy's towers against the night sky, and I thought about Veil and Bake and the pouch of house coin and about what a man with something to hide does when the light starts coming in. We'd won a round, but rounds aren't the fight. The exam had shown everyone what we were. Now the Academy would show us what it did to things it couldn't bury. I blew out the candle and let the dark settle, and I planned for the next move, because the next move was already coming. End of chapter 4. Lord Seo did not send another servant. He came himself. A black carriage rolled to a stop outside the fishmonger's, and the whole street went quiet, because the Lord of House Seo did not come to the West Market, and his coming here was not a visit. It was an errand, and errands like his ended one of 2 ways. He stepped down in the blue and silver of his house, an aging man with gray-streaked hair and a cold, unforgiving face, and he looked at the fishmonger's shop the way a man looks at a stain on his sleeve. Behind him, Bake hovered with his ledger, which told me whose counsel had brought him. Ye Rin saw him through the window and went very still. I moved to stand between them without thinking. "You don't have to go out there," I said, but she was already straightening, and when she spoke, her voice was calm. "Yes," she said, "I do." "You've made a spectacle of yourself," Lord Seo said, not looking at me, not once. "And the house has decided to overlook it. Your core has stabilized. That makes you useful again. You will return to the estate, resume your name, and be married into House Vex as agreed." He said it the way you'd read a shipping manifest. "Agreed," Ye Rin repeated, "and I heard the 19 years in it. You discarded me when I was broken. Now that I'm whole, you want me back, to sell." Her father's expression didn't change, but his fingers, folded over his cane, went a shade whiter. "Do not mistake sentiment for leverage, daughter," he said. "A C-rank you may be, but your name is still mine to command. Come home, or House Seo will make the remainder of your education very difficult." And there it was. The pouch, the rigged exam, Beck's tapping finger, all of it finally given a face. Ye Rin took a breath, the slow one, the one I'd taught her, and let it out. "My name," she said, "is not yours to command anymore. You crossed it off the rolls yourself. You told me, to my face, that a shattered daughter was worth less than the dress she stood in." Lord Seo's jaw tightened. "And now you are whole, and you will be worth a great deal to the house that kept you." The silence after was the loudest thing in the room. Then Ye Rin lifted her hand and let the violet flame bloom, clean and bright, between them. "I made myself whole," she said. "Not you. I did the work, with a teacher you'd have thrown in the street, in a room above a fish shop, because my own father called me a failure until I believed it." She let the flame die. "I am not your daughter anymore, and I am not for sale." Lord Seo looked at her for a long, cold moment, and then he looked at me, and I saw him file me away as the root of the problem. "This teacher of yours," he said to her, "has no license, no academy backing, and a name the city knows for failure. How long do you think he can protect you from what comes next?" "As long as he needs to," she said, and I had never been prouder of a student, and never more aware of the target on my back. The Lord turned and walked out without another word, and the black carriage rolled away, and the street exhaled like it had been holding its breath. When they were gone, Ye Rin turned to me, and for the first time her hands were shaking. "He'll make good on it," she said. "House Seo doesn't threaten, it just acts." I believed her, but I also knew something the Lord didn't, that every threat he made would push us further up the very ladder he wanted us off. That night, I hit the ceiling of my own knowledge for the second time, and it was worse than the first. To take Ye Rin from C to B, I needed to teach her structured combat casting, real offensive forms, and my own hands had never performed them at B rank. The system wouldn't let me teach what I couldn't do. "The instructor's knowledge is finite," the panel had said, and it was still true. I sat with my grandfather's books and realized the margin notes stopped at the exact place my own education had stopped, 9 years ago, when the academy had stopped teaching the worthless teacher anything worth knowing. So I did the humiliating, necessary thing. I found an old drill manual and I practiced the forms myself, in the dark, until my arms ached and my mana ran thin. Because the system's one mercy is that it counts the teacher's learning too. If I couldn't teach it yet, I could at least earn it. We drilled the combat forms until the floor was scuffed and our breath fogged in the cold. Yi Rin learned the way she learned everything, with a fury underneath her calm, and I taught her the way I'd taught for 9 years, by doing it first in front of her, and never pretending I was already perfect at it. The forms were real work, and the system paid for real work. Lessons. 24, then 26, then 28. Each one logged a form she'd actually performed, a sequence her body now knew. It was grinding, and it was slow, and it was the only honest road from C to B there was. And through all of it, the shadow of her father's threat sat in the corner of the room. We trained harder because of it. A house that meant to crush us was, without meaning to, the whetstone we sharpened ourselves against. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it, every single rep. The B rank threshold came on a Thursday, in the middle of a drill neither of us thought would be the one. Ye Rin threw the barrier form, and it didn't just hold. It rang, a clean dome of violet mana that caught her own reflected strike and turned it, and the whole back room lit up like a struck bell. She dropped the form and stared at her hands, breathing hard, and I saw the 19 years of failure fall away in a single exhalation. Class rank, B. The panel longed it, calm and certain, and I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Your father wanted you back, I said quietly, because you were useful, but you just became something he can't buy. She looked at me, and the hard calm in her face cracked into the first real smile I'd ever seen her wear. It was small. It was enough. The so what came fast this time. A B-rank discard student wasn't a curiosity anymore. She was a statement, and the West Quarter knew it. Merchants who'd never looked at us twice came to the door. Parents brought their hopeless children. The back room was suddenly, impossibly, in demand. It changed the money. Funds, -$1,870,000, and closing on zero for the first time in my adult life. I took the new pupils because a teacher teaches, but I watched them the way I watched everything now, with the system's quiet reminder that none of this was free and all of it had a cost. But the shadow grew too. House CO's silence was louder than its threats, and a silent noble house is a house sharpening something. I knew we'd climbed, and I knew exactly what climbing meant. The higher the rank, the harder they'd swing. I caught Beck watching the shop that evening, his ledger under his arm, and this time he didn't pretend he wasn't. He just stood in the doorway across the street and licked, and the look said everything. The academy was taking our measure, and the exam rigging I'd called out in public had put a price on my head. Ye Rin saw him too. He's been there an hour, she said. They're not sure what to do with us yet. I thought about it. A C rank was an annoyance. A B rank with a growing class and a street full of believers was a problem, and problems at the academy got solved. Then we don't give them time to decide, I said. We keep climbing. She looked at me, and for a moment I saw the weight of it all in her face. The house, the academy, the watching eyes. Then she set her jaw. Good, she said. I'm not done. I did the accounts by candlelight. Funds, -$1,870. Class rank, B. Reputation, 28. Lessons, 28. The debt was nearly gone, and for the first time I could see a day when I'd teach without a stone in my chest. But the ledger only counted money, and there was another column now, one the panel didn't show. The enemies column. House CO, Vale, Bake, Saran, each a name with reasons to want us gone. I looked out the window at the academy towers and thought about the second student I'd need to find, because one student, however bright, was a candle. A class would be a fire. Somewhere in the city, there were more discards, more students the academy had thrown away, more people waiting for someone to look. I'd been one of them. I blew out the candle and let the idea settle, because tomorrow I was going to start looking. End of chapter 5. I went looking in the lower quarter, where the academy's discards washed up. Not the nobles with houses to take them back, the commoners, the ones with no name to fall back on, the ones who were simply erased. I asked the soup kitchen keeper, the menders, the men who knew every face on the street. They told me about a girl named Han Mi-rae, expelled 3 months back for no talent, they said. But the way they said it had an edge, the way people talk when they don't believe the official story. She worked a loom now, they said. Barely. She'll not trust you, the keeper warned. She's had her fill of teachers. I found her in a cramped weaving house, bent over a loom, her hands moving faster than the eye could follow. 18 years old, dark hair in a practical ponytail, and eyes that didn't so much as lift when I said her name. I'm a teacher, I said. I don't want anything from you. I want to show you something. She didn't stop weaving. I know who you are, she said. The fishmonger's teacher, you fixed the Seo girl. There was no wonder in her voice, only wariness. I also know the academy expels commoners for a reason, and no teacher changes that. So whatever you're selling, I can't afford it. What were you expelled for? I asked. Her hands never slowed. No talent, she said, flat as a stamped paper. I failed the monolattice 3 times. Couldn't hold a thread, they said. Couldn't channel. Some people are just made wrong, and the academy doesn't keep the wrong ones. 3 times, I repeated. And what did the examiner tell you you were doing wrong? She finally looked up, and I saw it. The guarded, tired pride of a girl who'd been told she was broken and had decided to believe it. Nothing, she said. He just marked the ledger and told me to go. I asked her to do one thing, hold out her hand and try to gather mana, right there, over the loom. She did it reluctantly, and I watched, really watched, the way I'd learned to, and I saw what the academy's examiner hadn't bothered to see. Her mana gathered. It just gathered wrong. Your mana doesn't pool, I said slowly. It scatters. Every attempt, it disperses into a dozen tiny threads instead of one. That's why you can't hold a lattice. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, and her hands finally stopped. How do you know that? She whispered. Nobody even looked. There it was. The academy had looked at a commoner, seen a number that didn't fit their expectations, and stamped her broken without ever looking twice. Because I looked, I said, and because I've spent 9 years teaching the students everyone else threw away. I know the shape of a thing when I see it. There's something else, she said after a long moment, and her voice had gone careful. I can remember anything I see, once. She looked at me like she was bracing for the reaction. The examiner's ledger, the form he used, the exact way he marked me down. I saw it for half a second, and I could redraw it for you now. A perfect memory. In an academy that tested rote casting forms, it was worthless. They wanted mana, not recall. But I'd been reading my grandfather's books, and I knew what a perfect memory was worth to a caster who had to master 1,000 forms. Mi-rae, I said, that's not a flaw. That's the rarest talent in the city. They said it was cheating, she said quietly. When I passed a written exam by remembering the book, they said I hadn't learned anything, that I was just a copyist. I heard the old anger in it, the years of being told her gift was a trick. Then let's show them, I said, what a copyist can become. She came to the back room the next evening, and Ye-rin watched her arrive the way a cat watches another cat cross its territory. 2 discarded girls, one noble and one commoner, sizing each other up across a cleared floor that smelled of fish. This is Han Mi-rae, I said. She's going to be your classmate. She's a commoner, Ye-rin said, and it wasn't cruelty. It was the reflex of a house that had spent 19 years teaching her to rank people. I let the silence sit, and Mi-rae's chin came up, and then Ye-rin did something neither of us expected. She nodded, once, and stepped back to make room. I was discarded too, Ye-rin said, and that was all the apology the moment needed. 2 students now, and the panel in the corner of my eye ticked over. Students, too. And I felt the shape of the thing I was trying to build finally begin to take form. The problem with Mi-rae's mana was beautiful once you saw it. Where other casters gathered a single pool, she gathered a dozen threads at once, every one of them alive and pulling in a different direction. The academy had called it failure. I called it an untaught gift. She'd never once been shown how to braid them. So I taught her the braid, not to force the threads together. Her whole life had been people forcing her, but to give them a pattern to fall into, the way her hands already wove on the loom. The moment I said it, something clicked behind her eyes, and I watched a girl who'd been told she was broken realized she'd been holding a talent nobody had ever named. Lessons 34. Students 2. The system paid for it because it was real. I taught the braid the way I'd taught the breath, by doing it in front of her, and by the time the candle guttered, she'd gathered a single clean thread of mana for the first time in her life. The breakthrough came the way hers had to, through memory. Mireille had watched Yerin build her lattice 100 times, and the perfect memory meant she could reconstruct it exactly. But memory alone isn't mastery, and I made her build it with her own mana, thread by thread, until the shape held. When it did, a small, steady lattice, a little rough at the edges, but standing, she let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. "I failed this 3 times, she said. 3 times I stood in that hall and watched the examiner shake his head. And it was never me, it was the teaching." "It was the teaching," I agreed. "And now you have a teacher who looks." She looked at me, and for the first time the wariness in her face was gone, replaced by something raw and open. 2 students now, and both of them were starting to believe. That was the whole battle. The so what came a week later, in a sparring bout Dahl had arranged to test the new student. Mireille faced a merchant's guard twice her size, and she lost the first exchange, but not the second, because her perfect memory had already read the man's footwork, and the third time he moved, she was already where he was going. The guard swung, she slipped, and her practice staff came up under his guard with a precision that made the watching merchants go quiet. She didn't win. She was 3 months into training, and he was a soldier. But the way she moved made everyone there realize the same thing at once. This girl learned faster than anyone they'd ever seen. Word of it spread the way word always spreads. By the next day, Dahl was offering real money for the class's time, and parents were lining up with children the academy had told were hopeless. A rank wasn't far off, and the academy's ears, as always, were everywhere. It was the 2 of them working together that finally did it. Yerin's clean channeling and Mireille's perfect recall, one drilling forms while the other corrected the shape of them, faster and cleaner than I could alone. Class rank A. The panel logged it, and the back room was suddenly very quiet. An A-rank class, taught out of a fish shop, by a teacher the academy had thrown away. It was the kind of thing that was already bigger than a rumor. I looked at my 2 students, the shattered noble and the expelled commoner, and I felt something I'd chased for 9 years finally close its fingers around. "We're not done," Mireille said, before I could. "The academy's still out there, still stamping people broken." Yerin nodded, and I saw it then, plain as day. I hadn't just found students. I'd found people who'd been burned the same way I had, and they weren't going to stop climbing until the people who'd burned them had to watch. I did the accounts and stopped. Funds, $3,420, positive. For the first time in my adult life, the number at the bottom of the ledger didn't have a minus sign in front of it, and I sat there for a long minute just looking at it. A teacher who wasn't in debt. It felt like a different person's life. Reputation, 41. Lessons, 41. Class rank, A. Students, 2. The panel listed it all, quiet and patient, and I understood that the numbers weren't the point. They were the shadow of the point, the mark's real work left behind. The work was in that back room, and it was just getting started. But A rank came with a target, and I knew it. The academy had tolerated a B rank curiosity. An A rank class with a growing line of paying students was a threat, and threats at the academy got answers. I looked out at the towers and made a promise to myself. We'd need a 3rd student soon, and we'd need to be ready for what came with them. End of Chapter 6. The challenge came on academy stationery, sealed with the headmaster's own ring, and a servant in academy livery delivered it like a summons to a funeral. A formal exhibition duel, our class against a representative of the academy. The representative's name was Cale Arden, and the whole city was invited to watch. I read it twice. It wasn't a duel. It was a public execution of our reputation, dressed up in ribbon. Cale was the academy's star, drilled since childhood, and they'd matched him against us not to test us, but to show the city what happened to discards who climb too high. Yerin read over my shoulder. "They want to embarrass us," she said. Mireille just looked at the challenge and said, quietly, "They don't know what they just asked for." And she was right, in a way none of us understood yet. "We don't have to accept," I said, and I meant it. A duel with Kale was a duel we couldn't win outright, not yet, and refusing was the cautious play. But both my students looked at me the same way, and I recognized the look. It was the look of people who'd been told, "You can't," their whole lives, and were done hearing it. "If we refuse," Yerin said, "the city remembers us as the class that flinched. If we fight and lose badly, same result. If we fight and hold our own." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. A discards class holding its own against Kale Arden was the only thing the Academy couldn't buy back. "Then we hold our own," Mireille said. And I looked at the two of them and thought about the arithmetic. Kale had 19 years of drilling. We had weeks. But I had a girl with a perfect memory and a girl with a core that wouldn't break. And I realized, stopped believing we couldn't. We trained like people with everything to lose. Ye-rin drilled the defensive forms until her barrier rang clean every time. And Mireille did the thing only she could do. I obtained recordings of Kale's past duels, the Academy's public exhibitions, and she watched them, once each, and memorized them. She came back with the shape of him. His footwork was textbook, beautiful, disciplined, and utterly predictable, because a man who's never lost doesn't learn to improvise. "He always opens the same way," she said, marking it in the air with chalk. "Every single time, that's our window." A perfect memory is a weapon if you know how to aim it. And for the first time, I was starting to understand what my grandfather's margin notes had meant when he'd written, in that cramped hand, "Teach them to see, and the fighting takes care of itself." The arena was full, and that was the Academy's first mistake. They'd wanted an audience to watch us fall, but an audience can be turned. I walked my students to the ring through a crowd that was already murmuring our names. The fishmongers class, the discards, the ones who'd climbed from nothing. Kale was already there, immaculate in blue and gold, and the crowd parted for him like water. He didn't look at us. He just took his place in the ring and waited, the way a man waits for something too far beneath him to be worth hurrying. I put my hand on Ye-rin's shoulder, then Mireille's. "Remember what I taught you," I said. "You don't have to beat him. You have to make the city watch." Mireille's eyes were on Kale, and her perfect memory was already doing its quiet work. "He's going to open left," she said. "Watch." The bell rang, and Kale opened exactly as Mireille had said. Left foot, textbook form, a probing strike meant to test the distance. But Ye-rin had drilled against that exact opening 200 times, and she was already stepping where he wasn't, her barrier coming up clean and rigging. The crowd made a sound, surprise, the first note of it. Kale's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, and he pressed. He was faster, stronger, 19 years of drilling against weeks, and the gap told in every exchange. But he wasn't landing the way he expected to, and the crowd could see it. Mireille stood at the edge of the ring, and she wasn't fighting, she was reading. Every time Kale moved, her eyes tracked it, and between exchanges she'd murmur the shape of his next form, and Ye-rin would already be adjusting. Two students, working like one mind. The Academy had taught us to teach, the street had taught us to survive. Then it was Mireille's turn, and the whole arena saw what a perfect memory could do. Kale switched his rhythm, improvised, the way a star does when a fight doesn't go to script. And Mireille didn't just react, she anticipated. She was a half step ahead of him, every time, because she'd already seen the pattern underneath the improvisation. He feinted, and she didn't bite. He threw a combination, and she was already inside it, her practice staff slipping past his guard to tap his ribs. A touch, not a wound, but a touch on Kale Arden, in front of the whole city. The crowd went dead quiet, then roared. Lessons 47. The panel logged it, quiet beneath the noise. Not because we'd won, we hadn't, and I knew we wouldn't, but because the teaching was real and the learning was real, and a girl who'd been expelled for no talent had just touched the Academy's star in public. Kale won. Of course he won. He was the Academy's star, and the gap in raw power was real. But it took him 3 exchanges longer than the crowd expected, and when the bell rang, he was breathing harder than he should have been, and the look he gave us wasn't contempt anymore. It was something worse and better. Recognition. He'd felt the touch, and he knew, the way a prodigy always knows, that the students he'd been taught to ignore were closing the distance. "You," he said to Mireille, "are not untalented." It was the closest thing to an apology his kind ever gave. "I know," Mireille said. Your examiner just never looked, and the crowd heard it, and the story was already running. The Academy's own star had admitted, in public, that its examiners didn't leak. That was the crack we'd been waiting for, and it had just widened. The so what came before we left the arena. A minor noble house offered to sponsor the class's supplies. Another wanted to hire Mireille as a dueling tutor for their son. The West Quarter merchants, watching their own children's teachers hold their own against the Academy, opened their purses. Funds, $11,680. Reputation, 52. The panel ticked it all over, and I watched the numbers and felt the ground shift under us. We weren't a curiosity anymore. We were a contender, and contenders have resources, and contenders have enemies who stop being subtle. I caught Saran's face in the crowd, and it was the face of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. The Academy had set a trap, and the trap had backfired, and somewhere in the marble halls, Vale would be hearing about it. I let myself enjoy it for exactly one breath. Then I started planning for the backlash. Saran came to the shop that night, alone, which was how I knew it was serious. He didn't sneer, he didn't perform. He just stood in the doorway and said, "The headmaster is displeased. You've made the Academy look foolish twice in a row, and he's not a man who tolerates that." "Then he shouldn't rig his exams," I said. Saran's jaw worked. "You think you're building something here," he said, "but the Academy's been burying people like you for 100 years. What you're doing, it doesn't survive. It never has." He turned to go, then stopped. "There's a Foxkin girl in the East Quarter. You should leave her alone." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't have to. A Foxkin girl in the East Quarter, another discard, another student the Academy had thrown away and wanted to keep buried. Saran had meant it as a threat. It landed as a map. I sat with the ledger and the numbers. Lessons, 47. Class rank, A. Reputation, 52. Funds, $11,680. The debt was gone, the class was growing, and the Academy had just, in its attempt to bury us, handed me the name of the next student I'd go looking for. A Foxkin girl in the East Quarter, discarded for what she was, not for what she couldn't do. The oldest, ugliest reason of all. I thought about Yerin's shattered core and Mireille's scattered mana, and I understood that the Academy didn't just fail students, it sorted them, and the ones it couldn't use, it erased. Tomorrow, I'd go east, but tonight, I looked at my two students, at what we'd already built out of the people everyone else had thrown away, and I let myself believe, for one quiet moment, that the thing Saran said couldn't survive might turn out to be the only thing that could. End of Chapter 7. The East Quarter was the city's shadow. Where the West Market crowded and churned, the East Quarter kept its distance. Low timber longhouses, hanging lanterns, and faces that watched a stranger the way prey watches something that might be a predator. The Beastkin lived here, and the city had spent a century making sure they knew their place. I went looking for the Foxkin girl Saran had warned me away from, and I found instead a whole community the Academy had never once invited through its gates. Beastkin could attend, technically. Technically, so could anyone. But the exam was held in the city's tongue, and the examiners looked at a Foxkin's ears the way they looked at a commoner's patched cloves. The discrimination wasn't loud. It was quiet, bureaucratic, absolute, the kind that never raises its voice because it doesn't have to. And somewhere in the middle of it, I was told, there was a girl who'd been thrown out anyway, for being what she was, a Foxkin, a discard among the discarded. They told me her story around the communal fire, the way a tribe tells the stories that still hurt. She'd passed the written exam, first Foxkin in a decade to do it. She'd placed in the top ranks of the practical, and then the examiner had looked at her ears and her tail and had found, somehow, a reason to fail her anyway. Too unstable, they'd said. Beastkin mana runs wild, can't be trusted in a real duel. It was the oldest lie in the Academy's book, and the city believed it because it wanted to. The girl had come home with her head high and her tail low, and the core had closed around her like a wound. The fire crackled, and the old Foxkin who'd told me the story looked at me with flat amber eyes. "Your Academy," he said, "has taken everything from us and given back nothing. So tell me, teacher, why should we let you take one of ours?" It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. The elder found me before I'd even asked for the girl. An old foxkin woman with silver-streaked crimson hair and eyes that had buried too many of her own, and she stood in my path like a drawn blade. "You're the fishmonger's teacher," she said. "I know what you've done for the CO girl and the weaver's daughter." "Then you know I teach the ones the academy throws away," I said. She didn't soften. "I know you teach humans," she said, "and I know every human teacher who ever came to this quarter wanted something from us. Labor, or a story, or a body. So tell me what you want with our girl, and make it the truth, or leave now." I looked her in the eye and told her the truth, all of it. The system, the rule, the class I was building out of discards, and the enemies I was making on the way up. It was more than I'd told anyone. When I finished, the old foxkin woman was silent for a long time. Then she nodded once and stepped aside. Yu Na-bi was waiting by the longhouse when I got there, and she didn't look like a girl who'd been broken. 20 years old, crimson hair, fox ears tipped back, a tail that moved like its own creature, and amber eyes that held mine without flinching. There was no wall in her. There was a blade. "So you're the teacher," she said. "The one who makes the academy look stupid." Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I've been waiting for you. I knew someone would come eventually. The academy can't stand to let a foxkin pass their exam, and they can't stand it even more when one comes back." "I'm not here for the academy," I said. "I'm here because Saran warned me to stay away from you, and I've learned to read the academy's warnings backward." She laughed, sharp and real. "Then you're smarter than you look. All right, teacher, show me what you've got." They didn't let me teach her in a room. The quarter gathered around a sparring circle, and I understood. This was a test of more than her mana. If I flinched when her beastkin mana flared, if I looked at her ears the way the examiners had, the whole community would see it, and I'd be done. Elder Ash stood at the circle's edge and watched everything. "Show her the channeling form," she said. "Here, where we can all see." So I did. I walked into the circle and performed the form myself, slow and clean, while Na-bi watched, and I didn't flinch when her mana answered mine with a crackle like a storm. Beastkin mana is wild. That part of the academy's lie was true, but wild isn't the same as uncontrollable, and the moment Na-bi followed my form, the storm bent and shaped itself into a single clean thread. The quarter went quiet. Elder Ash's eyes widened, just slightly, and I saw the first crack in her guard. "You've shown us she can be taught," Elder Ash said that evening, and her voice was careful. "But the academy will not let a foxkin stand where your other students stand. It will move against her the way it moves against anything that threatens its sorting. So before I let her go with you, I need to know, how far will you take this?" "All the way," I said. "She's not a project, she's a student, and the academy's been wrong about every one of my students so far." Elder Ash studied me for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised me. She reached out and touched my shoulder, the way a matriarch touches kin. "Then teach her to win," she said, "not to endure. We've endured for 100 years and it's bought us nothing. Teach her to win in front of all of them, so they can never call her unstable again." I met her eyes. "That's the only thing I know how to do," I said. Na-bi learned differently from the other two. Yeren learned with fury and Mireille with memory, but Na-bi learned with instinct. She'd feel a form's shape in her body before her mind had even caught up, and her reflexes were the fastest I'd ever seen. The academy had called it instability. It was just speed, and speed is a gift. We drilled, and the system paid. Lessons, 58, then 60, then 63. Students, 3. The panel logged it all, quiet and certain, and I watched a foxkin girl who'd been told her mana ran wild learn to make it dance. The other two watched too, and I saw the class begin to knit into something real. 3 students now, a shattered noble, an expelled commoner, and a discarded foxkin. The exact 3 the academy would have sworn could never rise. And in that back room that smelled of fish, they were rising anyway, one real lesson at a time. The so what came the way it always did, but this time it came from the quarter. Na-bi went back with the channeling form and taught it to the beastkin children, and the elders watched her, and something in the quarter's guarded posture began, slowly, to loosen. A foxkin who could channel clean was a crack in a century-old story. And the city noticed. Class rank S. An S-rank class with a foxkin in it wasn't a rumor, it was a declaration, and it ran through the West Market and the East Quarter both. Sponsors came, donations came, the Beastkin merchants for the first time brought their trade to our door. Reputation, 63. Funds, $24,850. The panel ticked it all over, and I watched the numbers climb and thought about what an S-rank really meant. It meant we weren't a curiosity anymore. It meant the Academy couldn't ignore us. And it meant the next move, when it came, would be aimed at our throats. The notice came 3 days later, and it was signed by the headmaster himself. An official complaint, it said, concerning the enrollment of an unlicensed beastkin practitioner of unstable bloodline. A hearing had been scheduled. The Academy, which had never once lifted a finger to teach the beastkin, was now formally concerned for their safety. Na-Bi read it with her chin up and her tail very still. They did the same thing to my mother, she said quietly. A hearing, a fine, a door closed in her face. The Academy doesn't fight you. It just keeps you out, legally, until you stop trying. Then we stop letting them write the rules, I said. They want a hearing. We'll give them one, with 1,000 people watching, and an S-rank foxkin standing in the middle of it, holding a channeling thread so clean they'll choke on their own complaint. Na-Bi looked at me, and slowly, the blade in her face turned into a smile. I did the accounts and stared at the numbers. Lessons, 63. Class rank, S. Reputation, 63. Funds, $24,850. The class was solvent, growing, and now, for the first time, facing a formal hearing designed to crush it. The Academy had finally stopped pretending we were beneath its notice. 3 students, 3 discards, 3 people the Academy had thrown away and would now have to answer for, in public, with the whole city watching. I looked at the notice again and felt the old anger settle into something cold and useful. They'd drawn the line. We'd cross it. I thought about my grandfather's notes, and about Mira the librarian, and about every student the Academy had ever stamped unfit and erased. The hearing was coming, and for the first time, I didn't just want to survive it. I wanted to win. End of Chapter 8. The hearing was held in a chamber built for verdicts, and the Academy had packed it. Officials at a high table, an examiner with a ledger, and a gallery of spectators who'd come to watch a foxkin be put in her place. The whole thing had the smell of a theater, where the ending was already written. Beck prosecuted, of course. The Academy always used the same tool. He read the complaint in his thin, officious voice. Unlicensed practitioner, unstable bloodline, a danger to the orderly conduct of sanctioned duels. And every word was aimed at Na-Bi's ears and her tail, because the law was just a costume for the prejudice underneath. Na-Bi sat beside me, and she didn't tremble. She held her chin the way her mother must have held it, and her tail lay still, and I understood that this room was a place her people had been dragged through 100 times. The difference was, this time, the room was full of people who wanted to watch her win. The Academy's witnesses came one after another, and each one said the same thing in a different costume. An examiner who'd observed her mana flare, a duel official who'd never seen control like that be safe. None of them had taught her a single lesson. All of them were certain she couldn't be trusted. I listened and made notes, because a lie repeated is a pattern, and patterns are where you find the seams. Every witness described her mana the same way: wild, unstable, dangerous, and not one of them could name a single duel, a single incident, a single person she'd actually hurt. The case against her was made entirely of adjectives. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I stood up and asked the room the question the Academy had spent a century avoiding. If beastkin mana is so unstable, I said, why has the Academy never once offered to teach a beastkin to control it? Either it can't be taught, in which case every examiner here has failed for 100 years, or you simply never tried. The room shifted. You could feel it. The spectators leaning forward, the officials glancing at each other, the careful fiction of the hearing starting to show its seams. Bake's finger tapped twice on his ledger, the old nervous rhythm, and I filed it away. The Academy has standards, Beck said, that beastkin blood cannot meet. And there it was, plain as day, in front of a full gallery. Not unstable, not dangerous, just cannot meet. A whole people ruled unfit by a sentence, with no test ever administered and no evidence ever offered. Na-bi stood up without being asked. "Then test me," she said, and her voice carried to the back of the room. "Right here, right now. Put me against anyone in this academy and let them see what beastkin blood can and cannot do." The room went still. Beck looked at Saron, and the trap we'd walked into became a trap we'd sprung. The officials conferred, and I watched them do the arithmetic. Refuse the challenge, and the academy looks afraid. Accept it, and they risk exactly what they'd come here to prevent, a foxkin winning in public. In the end, arrogance decided. They accepted. "A sanctioned duel," the presiding official said. "Your student against a representative of the academy." The representative, when he stepped forward, was the academy's third-ranked duelist. Not Kale, but a name I recognized from the boards. A safe choice, they thought, strong enough to win, familiar enough not to embarrass the house. I looked at Nabi, and she looked back, and her amber eyes were bright. "He telegraphs," Mireille murmured from beside me, her perfect memory already working. "Right foot before every lunge. He did it twice in the last exhibition." I nodded and leaned close to Nabi. "You already know how to win this," I said. "You just have to show them." They cleared a space in the middle of the chamber, and the duel began. And it was over before the academy's man understood what had happened. He lunged, right foot first, exactly as Mireille had said, and Nabi was already gone, a blur of crimson and instinct, inside his guard before his blade finished its arc. She didn't use a single wild strike. She used the channeling form I'd taught her, the clean thread, and she guided his own momentum past her and tapped him once, twice, 3 times, light, precise, undeniable. The academy's third-ranked duelist stood in the middle of the chamber with his guard hanging open, and his face slack. The room was silent for a full second. Then the quarter's people, packed into the back of the gallery, began to roar, and the sound rolled over the officials' table like a wave. Lessons, 74. The panel logged it, calm and certain. A foxkin had just beaten the academy's best, cleanly, in the very room they'd built to bury her. The officials had no choice, and they knew it. 1,000 eyes had just watched a beastkin outduel the academy's representative with textbook control. To rule her unstable now would be to admit the whole hearing was a fraud. The presiding official's face was the color of old parchment. "The complaint is dismissed," he said, and the words came out like they cost him. "The practitioner demonstrates adequate control." Adequate. The room knew what it had just seen, and adequate was the last gasp of a prejudice that couldn't even lie convincingly anymore. The quarter's roar turned to laughter. Na-bi walked back to me through the noise, and her tail was high and her eyes were wet. "My mother," she said, and her voice cracked, "waited her whole life for a room to look at her like that and never got it." I put my hand on her shoulder. "Then this one's for her," I said. The "so what" spilled out of that hall and ran through the city like a flood. A foxkin had beaten the academy in its own hearing. The story grew teeth in every telling. The beastkin quarter was alive with it, and the West Market, and by nightfall, half the city knew the academy had tried to bury a girl and had buried its own reputation instead. It changed everything about our money. Funds, $43,560. The beastkin merchants, freed at last from the story that their mana was worthless, brought real trade to our door. Sponsors who'd been waiting to see which way the wind blew opened their purses. An S-rank class with a public win was worth more than gold. Reputation, 71. The panel ticked it over, and I watched the number and thought about what it cost. Every win drew more believers, and every believer drew more of the academy's attention. We'd humiliated them in public. The only question now was how they'd hit back. Saran found me that night on the walk home, and for the first time, there was no performance in him. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "The headmaster doesn't lose in public. The last teacher who made him look foolish." He stopped, and I saw something I'd never seen on his face. Fear. "What happened to him?" I asked. Saran looked away. He was accused of misconduct. Evidence appeared. A forged letter, a student's testimony bought. He was stripped of his license and run out of the city. The academy doesn't need to win the duel, Jun-ho. It just needs to win the record. "Then I'll watch my back," I said, and I meant it. And so should you, Siron. You're a witness to what they do to people who embarrass them. How long before you're the forged letter? He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, and his shoulders were lower than I'd ever seen them. I told my students everything that night. The forged letter, the bought testimony, the way the Academy won by winning the record. They listened, and I watched the three of them harden in the telling. These were people who'd already lost everything to a rigged system once. They weren't afraid, they were ready. Then we beat them at their own game, Ye-rin said. We keep records too. Every lesson, every score, every witness. Mireille nodded, and I saw her perfect memory turn toward the problem like a blade. I can memorize everything, she said. Every duel, every ruling, every lie they've told in public. Nabi looked at me, and her amber eyes were steady. They took my mother's chance, she said. They don't get to take mine. I looked at my three students, the noble, the commoner, the foxkin, and I understood that whatever came next, the Academy had made a terrible mistake. It had given us something to fight for together. I did the accounts by candlelight and stared at the number. Funds, $43,560. Class rank, S. Reputation, 71. Lessons, 74. The class was strong, solvent, and united, and the Academy was about to come for us with forged letters and bought testimony and 100 years of practice burying people. But there was something else in the ledger now, something the numbers didn't show. 3 students who trusted each other, a quarter that believed, a city that was starting to watch. The Academy could forge a record, but it couldn't forge what 1,000 people had just seen with their own eyes. I closed the book and looked out at the towers against the night. SS rank was close. I could feel it in the way they trained, in the speed of the drills, in the certainty that had replaced the fear. And beyond SS rank, I was starting to believe there was something the Academy had never once prepared for. End of chapter 9. It came faster than I'd expected. 2 constables at the door at dawn, with a folded paper and the kind of official calm that makes the blood run cold. A complaint has been filed, the first one said, alleging the use of unsanctioned teaching methods and the endangerment of a minor student. I read the paper and my stomach dropped, not because it was true, but because it was good. A forged letter, signed in a hand that wasn't mine, promising a noble parent results their child could never achieve, in exchange for coin. The Academy's favorite weapon, exactly as Saran had warned. I'd never written a word of it. The signature is not mine, I said. I'll prove it in any court in the city. The constable's face didn't change. That's for the hearing to decide, sir. In the meantime, your license to teach is suspended, pending review. Just like that. No duel, no witness, no evidence. Just a paper and the law pointed at my throat. The suspension was the point, and I understood it the moment the door closed. The Academy didn't need to win the hearing. It needed to stop the class, and a suspended license stopped it cold. No sanctioned duels, no official rank, no legitimacy. The parents who'd been lining up vanished overnight. My 3 students sat in the back room and looked at me, and I saw the fear they were trying not to show. So they finally did it, Ye-rin said. They forged their letter. Mireille's jaw was tight. Nabi's tail was very still. We knew they would, she said. We planned for this. We did, I said, and I made myself believe it. A suspended license stops the sanctioned work. It doesn't stop the learning. I looked at them, one by one. So we keep learning, and while we do, we find the seam in their forged letter, because every forgery has one, and I have a student who never forgets. Mireille took the forged letter and read it once, and that was enough. Her perfect memory had it, every stroke. She closed her eyes and reconstructed it, and then she opened them and pointed. There, she said, the seal. It's the Academy's house seal, but it's the old one. They changed the seal 3 years ago. This letter uses the retired design. I stared at her, then at the letter. She was right. I'd seen the old seal on documents from my own student days. A forgery made by someone with access to the Academy's records, but not its current stationery. A seam, small as a splinter, and exactly the kind of thing a perfect memory was built to catch. That proves it's fabricated, Ye-rin breathed. But a forged letter still needs a forger to confess, or an official to care. She was right, and that was the harder half. We could prove the letter was fake. The trick was getting someone with the power to act to look at it. The answer arrived that afternoon in a carriage of violet and white, and the whole academy seemed to hold its breath. Royal Examiner Seraphine, the Crown's own auditor, come to the Royal Magic Academy to review its examination records. The timing, I would learn, was not an accident. The Crown had heard the rumors too. I watched her step down, a composed woman in severe high-collared robes, silver hair pinned, gray eyes that took in the academy the way a ledger takes in a column of figures. She didn't smile at the headmaster's greeting. She didn't bow. She just inclined her head once and walked inside. The Crown is auditing the exams, Mira told me later, in the library, her voice low. They're looking into the ranking irregularities. Someone in the palace read the West Market stories and got curious. I looked at the forged letter in my coat and felt the shape of a door swinging open. "We give her the letter," I said that night, and the three of them looked at me. "The Royal Examiner is auditing the exams. If she's real, if she's actually impartial, then a forged letter under a retired seal, filed the same week she arrived, is exactly the kind of thing an auditor doesn't ignore." "And if she's not real?" Nabi asked. "If she's in Vile's pocket?" It was the right question, and I'd thought about it. Then we lose nothing we haven't already lost. A suspended license and a forged letter. We're already buried, but if she's real, this is the first crack in the Academy's wall that ever let light through. Mireille copied the letter in her mind and wrote it out fresh, seal and all, and I folded it carefully. "I'll deliver it myself," I said. An accused teacher walking into a royal audit with proof of forgery? That's a story even a bot auditor can't ignore. Ye Rin put her hand on my arm. "Then come back," she said. Seraphine received me alone in the Academy's guest chamber, and she didn't offer me a seat. "A suspended teacher," she said, "walking into a royal audit. Either you're very brave or very foolish, or you have something I need to see." I set the letter on the table between us. "All three," I said. She read it without touching it, then produced a lens and studied the seal. The silence stretched. Then she said, flat as a verdict, "This seal was retired 3 years ago. Whoever forged this had access to the Academy's old records, but not its current stationery. A competent forgery, a careless one." She looked up. "Who sent it?" "The same people," I said, "who rig your ranking exams. Follow the seal and you'll find the hand. Follow the hand and you'll find the headmaster." Seraphine's gray eyes held mine, unreadable. Then she picked up the letter and tucked it inside her robes. "Go," she said, "and say nothing of this. If you're right, this will be very loud, very soon." We didn't wait for the Crown. We kept drilling because a suspended license was a stop, not a stop sign, and the work didn't care about the law. The three of them pushed each other the way only people who've been burned together can, and the back room rang with it night after night. The SS rank threshold came the way all the big ones do, in the middle of a drill, without ceremony. The three of them cast together, Ye Rin's clean channel, Mireille's perfect recall, Nabi's impossible speed, and the combined form held the way it never had before, and the panel logged it. Class rank, SS. Lessons, 88. Reputation, 78. The numbers ticked over, quiet and certain, and I watched my 3 students, a shattered noble, an expelled commoner, a discarded foxkin, stand together at the rank the Academy had sworn none of them could ever reach. The suspension said we couldn't be a class. The system said otherwise. The so what of an SS rank couldn't be suspended. The rumor ran through the city. The fishmonger's class had reached SS even under a ban, and it did what rumors do. It made the Academy's suspension look like what it was, an attempt to stop a thing that wouldn't be stopped. Money followed, quietly. Funds, $68,120. Merchants and miner houses, sensing which way the wind was turning, found ways to fund us that didn't run through the official channels. A suspended teacher was dangerous to associate with, but an SS rank class about to be vindicated by the Crown was something else entirely. And through it all, the Academy was silent, which was the most frightening sound of all. Vale wasn't moving. He was waiting. And a waiting headmaster with 100 years of machinery behind him is a man sharpening a very long knife. The royal summons came on the 4th day, not from the Academy, from the Crown. Royal Examiner Seraphine, it said, would hear testimony regarding the ranking examinations and the suspension of one Kang Jun-ho in open session 3 days hence. The audit had widened, and the Academy's own forged letter had lit the fuse. I read it twice, then handed it to my students. She followed the seal, I said, and I heard the wonder in my own voice. She actually followed it. Nabi read it over Ye-rin's shoulder, and her tail gave a single sharp flick. The crown is listening, she said. For the first time in 100 years, the crown is listening. Vielle would have to answer, now, in open session, with a forged letter on the table and a royal examiner who didn't blink. I thought about the 100 years of buried teachers and the forged letters and the bought testimony, and I understood that the fight we'd been having in a fish-smelling back room had just walked into the light. I sat with the ledger and the numbers, and for once the numbers weren't the story. Lessons, 88. Class rank, SS. Reputation, 78. Funds, $68,120. The class was the strongest it had ever been, and the crown was about to hear the truth of what the Academy had done. But I knew better than to think it was over. Vale had 100 years of practice burying people, and a man doesn't reach the headmaster's chair by fighting fair. The open session would be the arena, and in an arena, the Academy had every weapon, except the truth, which was the one thing it had never learned to forge. 3 days. I looked at my students, at what we'd built out of the people everyone else threw away, and I made a quiet promise. Whatever happened in that session, the Academy was going to have to say, out loud, in public, what it had spent 100 years saying in the dark. End of Chapter 10. The session was held in the city's tribunal hall, under the Crown's own banner, and the gallery was packed to the rafters. The Academy's rigged exams were finally going to be spoken of in the open, and half the city had come to hear it. The other half had come to see whether the Crown would actually do anything. Royal Examiner Seraphine sat at the high table with a stack of records before her, and a face that gave nothing away. On the Academy's side sat Vale, composed as ever, and Bake, whose tapping finger I could already see from across the hall. 2 men, 100 years of lies, and 1 room full of witnesses. I walked in with my 3 students, and the gallery rippled. The fishmongers class, the discards, the ones who'd climbed to SS rank under a suspended license. We took our seats, and I felt the weight of the room settle, and I thought, whatever happens here, it happens in the light now. Seraphine didn't waste time on theater. She laid out the examination records, years of them, and began to ask the questions the Academy had spent a century dodging. Why did commoners' scores cluster just below the passing line? Why did noble failures get retests that commoner failures never received? Why did the ledger show corrections with no recorded reason? Vielle answered in smooth, patient sentences that meant nothing, and I watched Seraphine's gray eyes never leave him. She wasn't swayed by his performance. She was reading the records underneath it, and the records were a disaster the Academy had always assumed no one would ever actually look at. Then she called Bake. He walked to the stand with his ledger clutched to his chest like a shield, and his tapping finger was going double time, and I saw Mirei's eyes narrow from beside me. She was watching him the way she'd watched Kale, and I knew what that meant. She was memorizing everything. Seraphine asked to see the ledger, and Bake handed it over with a hand that shook, and the room watched her page through it. Curious, she said, without inflection. Every commoner's entry carries 2 corrections. Every noble's carries none. What is the correction for, Examiner Bake? The silence was absolute. Marking errors, Beck said. Routine. But his finger was tapping the rail now, and Mirei leaned close to me. I can reproduce it, she whispered. The whole ledger, every entry, every mark, the exact pages he turned to first. I looked at her. Then wait, I said. Let him lie a little longer first. Because the trick to catching a man like Beck isn't to interrupt his lie. It's to let the lie grow until it can't be taken back, and then to show the room the truth it was hiding under. Seraphine, I realized, was doing the same thing. She knew. She was just waiting for the right moment to strike. The moment came when Seraphine turned to the gallery and asked if anyone could speak to the record. Mirei stood, and the room quieted. I can reproduce the examiner's ledger from memory, she said. Every entry. I saw it for less than a minute. Beck's face went the color of milk. They gave her chalk and a board, and she wrote, from memory, the exact entries, dates, names, scores, and the corrections. 2 marks on every commoner, none on any noble. The room leaned forward as the pattern took shape under her hand. It wasn't a memory anymore. It was a weapon, and it was aimed at the Academy's heart. The corrections, Seraphine said, are not random. They are the mechanism. A commoner's score is marked down twice, once in the practical, once in the written, so that no commoner can ever clear the rank threshold, regardless of performance. She turned to Bake. You have been caught, examiner, in front of the crown and in front of this city. Bake broke the way men like him always break, not with dignity, but with a scramble. It wasn't my design, he said, and his voice cracked. I was told. The corrections, the thresholds, they came from above. House CO paid for the commoner thresholds. The headmaster signed the policy. The room erupted. Viel rose to his feet, his composure cracking for the first time I'd ever seen, and Seraphine rapped the table once, hard, and the noise died like a snuffed candle. The headmaster signed what policy? She said, and her voice was ice. Say it again, clearly, for the record. Back looked at Vale, and Vale looked at Back, and in that look I saw 100 years of buried teachers and forged letters and bought testimony, all of it balanced on the edge of a single frightened man's next sentence. Then Back sagged and said it all, the policy, the payoffs, the names, and the wall the Academy had spent a century building came down. The scandal broke before we left the hall. Seraphine ordered the Academy's examination records sealed, and Vale's authority suspended pending full review, and the city was already running with it. A commoner's perfect memory had caught the Academy's rigged exams in front of 1,000 witnesses. It was the kind of story that ends dynasties. I watched Viel leave, his face a careful mask that didn't quite cover the fury underneath, and I felt something I'd been chasing for 9 years finally settle into place. Not triumph, justice maybe, or the first real breath of it. The man who'd called me worthless in front of the whole staff room had just been exposed by the students he'd thrown away. Mireille stood at the board, her chalk still in her hand, and the gallery was on its feet for her. An expelled commoner, expelled for no talent, had just dismantled the Academy's entire ranking system from memory. I walked over and put my hand on her shoulder. You did it, I said. She looked at me, and her eyes were bright. We did, she said. The so what came in a flood. Reputation, 84. Funds, $97,340. The suspension was lifted the same afternoon. Seraphine saw to that, and the class's name ran through the city like a tide. Parents who'd vanished came back. Merchants who'd gone quiet sent word. The discards of the Academy had become its undoing, and everyone wanted to stand near the fire. The 3 of them stood on the tribunal steps and looked out at a crowd chanting their names, and I saw it land on each of them differently. On Ye Rin, a fierce vindication. On Mireille, a quiet, disbelieving joy. On Na Bi, the high tail and bright eyes of a girl whose people had just watched their 100-year lie burn. Lessons, 118. The panel logged it, calm and certain. Not the lessons I'd taught them that day, the lessons of a lifetime. The real work of 9 years and a fish-smelling back room finally counted where everyone could see it. The Academy had rigged the game. We'd just changed the game. Vale didn't go quietly. I knew he wouldn't. A man like him, exposed but not yet fallen, starts reaching for the levers that still work, and he still had House CO and the Noble Council and 100 years of the city's fear. I caught a glimpse of him in a side chamber, in conference with men in noble colors, and I knew the fight wasn't over. He's going to make it about something else, Ye Rin said that night, and she was right. He can't defend the rigged exams, so he'll change the subject. Make it about us, about an unlicensed teacher, a beastkin, a noble's runaway daughter. Make us the danger, and the exams the distraction. She'd grown up in that house. She knew how it worked, and so did I now. The Academy had lost the record. That meant its next move would be the oldest one in its book. When you can't win the argument, you burn down the people making it. We sat in the back room that night, the 4 of us, because there were 4 now, and would be more, and we didn't celebrate. We planned. Bake was broken, and the exams were exposed, but Vale still sat in his chair, and the Noble Council still held the city's purse strings, and the war wasn't won. just finally begun in the open. They'll come for us harder now, I said, and I didn't soften it. We've stopped being an embarrassment. We're a threat to the whole order they built. Nabi's tail flicked. Good, she said. Let them come. We've been waiting for them to stop pretending we don't exist. I looked at my students, the noble, the commoner, the foxkin, and at the SS rank panel glowing quiet in the corner of my eye, and I understood that we'd crossed a line there was no crossing back from. The academy would either fall or we would. There was no third ending anymore. I did the accounts, and the numbers told one story while the city told another. Lessons 118. Class rank SS. Reputation 84. Funds $97,340. The class was solvent and vindicated, and the academy was exposed, and still I felt the cold wind of what was coming. Because the truth doesn't win by itself. It has to be carried through the noble council, through the city's courts, through whatever Vale had left to throw at us. We'd won a battle in the light. The war would be fought in the dark, and the academy had a century of practice there. I closed the ledger and looked at the door, and I thought about the students still out there, the ones the academy hadn't finished burying yet. SS rank was ours, but if we were going to survive what came next, we'd need more than 3 students. We'd need an army. End of chapter 11. After the tribunal, they came. Not in a trickle, in a line. The students the academy had stamped unfit and thrown away, the ones who'd read the news and walked across the city to a fishmonger's door, because for the first time in their lives, there was a teacher who'd take them. I stood in the doorway and felt the weight of it. There were too many. I couldn't take them all. The system would only pay for real lessons, and I had only so much mana, so many hours, so much of myself to pour out. But I looked at their faces, and I saw 9 years of my own failures and my own students, and I knew I couldn't turn them away either. So I did what I'd always done. I taught who I could, and I found honest ways to send the rest to teachers who'd take them. And I promised the ones I turned away that the door wasn't closed, just narrow. Come back, I told them. The class is growing. There will be room. And I meant it. The boy was the last one, and he waited until the crowd had gone before he stepped forward. 17, thin, wearing the tattered remnants of a squire's tabard, blue and gold, the academy's colors, but stripped of its badges. He looked like a thing that had been returned to a shop with its value spent. I was Cale Arden's squire, he said, and the name hung in the air between us. He dismissed me after the duel, said I'd embarrassed him, that a squire who couldn't keep up with a commoner's speed was dead weight. The boy's voice was flat, but his hands were shaking. I have nowhere to go. I looked at him, at the tabard and the shaking hands, and I understood that Cale's cruelty had a body count too. The Academy's star had thrown away his own squire the way the Academy threw away everyone, because the boy had made him look slow, and a star can't abide that. Why did you come to me? I asked, and it wasn't a test. I wanted to know. The boy met my eyes for the first time. Because you took the foxkin, he said, and the weaver's daughter, and the CO girl. You take the ones everyone else threw away. I thought, maybe there's room for one more. There's always room for someone willing to work, I said. But understand what this is. I don't teach talent. I teach people, and the system pays for real learning. And if you come here, you work until your hands bleed, and you don't quit. Cale threw you away for being slow. I'll throw you away for being lazy. Those aren't the same thing. The boy's chin came up, and for a second I saw something steel under the shaking. I'm not lazy, he said. I spent 3 years carrying Cale's kit and memorizing every form he used. I'm just not fast, and speed, apparently, is all anyone in this city values. What's your name? I asked. Yoon Min Jae, he said, and that was it. Yoon Min Jae, 17, the Academy's cast-off squire, became my 4th student. The panel ticked over, quiet in the corner of my eye. Students, 4. The class wasn't 3 discards anymore. It was beginning to be something bigger. The 3 girls looked at him with a wariness that was half protectiveness and half the old reflex. Every new face was another potential betrayal. But Min Jae didn't flinch. He bowed, properly, the way a squire bows, and when he straightened, there was a steadiness in him that 3 years of carrying Cale's kit had built. You'll start at the bottom, I told him. Not because you're untalented, because everyone starts at the bottom, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something. First lesson, tonight, bring nothing but yourself. He nodded, and I saw the first flicker of something like hope cross his face. Min-jae's first lesson wasn't glamorous. I taught him the channeling breath, the same one I'd taught Ye-rin in that alley a lifetime ago, and I watched him struggle with it the way everyone struggles. Too tense, too fast, too sure he was doing it wrong. Kale had taught him to serve. He'd never been taught to breathe. Slower, I said. You're not trying to impress anyone here. You're trying to learn. The words landed, and I saw his shoulders drop a fraction, and the breath came steadier. 3 years of being a squire had taught him to read a room. Now he had to learn to read himself. Lessons 121. The panel paid for it because it was real. And watching Min-jae, I understood something I'd been too busy to see. The system didn't just grow students, it grew me too. Every new student was a new kind of teaching, and every kind of teaching was a lesson the panel logged. The class grew around him the way a lattice grows, not by addition, but by finding the shape it was always going to be. Ye-rin took Min-jae under her wing, the way she took everything, with a fierce protectiveness. Mi-rae quizzed him on forms until he could recite them in his sleep. Na-bi just watched, and after a week, she nodded once, and that was her approval. Lessons 134, then 142. The numbers climbed, and so did the class's reputation, and so did the line at the door. The Academy's exposed exams had done something Vale never anticipated. They turned every discard in the city into a recruit, and every recruit into a witness to what a real class could be. Funds, $131,600. The money followed the momentum. A vindicated SS rank class with a growing roster was the safest bet in the city, and the merchants knew it. I watched the ledger climb and thought, this is what the Academy was afraid of. Not our rank, our numbers. The so what came 3 weeks in. At a market exhibition, Dole arranged to show off the new student. Min-jae stepped into the ring against a merchant's guard, and the crowd expected him to be slow. The cast-off squire, the boy Kale had thrown away. They were half right. He wasn't fast, he just wasn't where the guard swung. 3 years of memorizing Kale's forms had given him a duelist's mind, and the channeling I'd taught him gave that mind a body that finally did what it was told. He read the guard, sidestepped, and tapped his ribs twice before the man finished his first lunge. The crowd went quiet, then loud. Kale's cast-off squire, beating a trained guard with the same forms Kale had taught him. That was a story the city loved, and it ran. Reputation, 89. I watched Min-jae catch his breath in the ring, and I saw the last of the shaking leave his hands. He'd found the thing Kale said he didn't have. But the noble council was watching too, and what they saw frightened them. The Academy's exposed exams were one thing, a scandal, survivable. A growing SS rank class of discards, vindicated by the crown and funded by the market, was another thing entirely. It was the beginning of a different order, and the council meant to stop it. Ye-rin told me what she knew, the way only someone raised in those halls could. They'll move through the Academy first, she said. Val's suspended, but he's still got the council's ear. They'll find a way to discredit the class. A new accusation, a new forgery, something worse. They won't attack the students. They'll attack the teacher. I'd known it was coming. It always did. The Academy's favorite target had always been the one standing in front of the class, and I'd been that man for 9 years. The difference now was, I wasn't standing alone anymore. It came the next week, a sealed order from the Noble Council, citing irregularities in the licensing of an unaccredited teaching establishment and demanding a full inspection of our facilities and methods. The same song, a new verse. Val's hand was on it, I was certain, even suspended. I read it in front of my 4 students and didn't hide it. They're going to try to drown us in process, I said. Inspections, audits, requirements we can't meet because they were written to be unmeetable. It's how the Academy buries you without ever winning a duel. Then we meet their process with ours, Ye-rin said, and her voice had the old steel in it. We keep records. We comply with everything. We make it so clean they can't find a single crack, and we let the crown see them trying. Mi-rae nodded, her perfect memory already turning to the paperwork. I can help with that, she said. I did the accounts, and the numbers were the strongest they'd ever been. Lessons 142, students 4, class rank SS, reputation 89, funds $131,600. The class was growing, funded and vindicated, and standing in the path of a council that had decided it couldn't be allowed to. But there was a difference now, and I felt it in the quiet of that rented room. 4 students, a quarter that believed, a city that was watching, a crown that had finally looked. The academy could forge letters and buy testimony and bury the record, but it couldn't bury what 1,000 people had seen with their own eyes. SS rank was ours, and SSS was close. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The council was going to make its move, and when it did, the class was going to be ready, not to endure it, but to break through it. End of chapter 12. The inspection was a weapon, and I knew it the moment they arrived. 3 inspectors with clipboards in the flat courtesy of men who've already written their report, poking at our facilities, a cleared floor, a crate of chalk, 4 students and a teacher, as if they expected to find fraud and were disappointed not to. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. We taught real lessons in a back room, and the records were impeccable. Mireille had seen to that. Every score, every hour, every copper accounted for. The inspectors left with nothing to report, and I watched them go and knew the council wasn't done. This was the feint. They're buying time, Ye-rin said, and she was right. The inspection is noise. They want to see how we respond, what we reveal, where our weakness is. The real move comes after. I nodded. Then we don't reveal anything. We keep teaching, and we get stronger while they waste time watching us. So we did the one thing the council couldn't inspect away. We kept working. The back room rang with drills and corrections and the small daily failures that become mastery. And the 4 of them pushed each other harder than any examiner ever could, because they weren't training to pass a test. They were training to prove something. Lessons 151, then 158. The panel logged it all, quiet and certain, and I watched the class knit tighter under pressure. The council thought it was squeezing us. It was forging us. The way every attempt to bury a discard had, in the end, only made them harder to break. Min-jae, a month in, could now read a duel the way Kale read a board, and he'd stopped flinching at his own mana. Ye-rin's barrier rang like a bell. Mireille's memory had become the class's ledger, its shield, its living archive. Nabi was simply the fastest person in any room she entered. SS rank was a cage now. They were ready to break it. What does SSS even mean? Min-jae asked one night, and the question hung in the air. None of the others had ever been allowed to ask it. The Academy's rank system had always been a wall, not a door, a thing that kept people out, never a thing that let them understand what was on the other side. I thought about it before I answered. SSS is the rank the Academy reserves for its founder's line, I said. It's not a score, it's a statement that some people are born to the top and everyone else is born to serve them. That's why they've never once let a commoner or a beastkin or a discarded noble anywhere near it. Then it's not a rank we're chasing, Nabi said, and her amber eyes were bright. It's the door they built to keep us out. I looked at my 4 students and felt the truth of it settle over the room. Then let's stop chasing it, I said, and start taking it down. The SSS threshold wasn't a single skill. It was the thing the 4 of them could only do together, a combined casting, 4 mana signatures braided into one standing form, the way my grandfather's notes described and the Academy's own manuals called impossible for anyone outside the founder's line. We drilled it until the floor shook. Ye-rin anchored it, her clean channel the spine of the form. Mireille guided it, her memory holding the exact structure against the chaos. Nabi threaded it, her speed weaving the 4 threads before they could fray, and Min-jae, the cast-off squire, held the whole thing steady with a calm that 3 years of carrying Kale's kit had hammered into him. It failed a dozen times, then 20. The threads frayed, the form collapsed, and they went again, because that was the whole secret I'd spent 9 years trying to teach. The discards don't fall because they're weak. They fall because everyone told them they would, and the only cure is getting back up until they stop believing it. It held on the 23rd try, and the moment it did, The whole back room lit up royal violet, not the flicker of a student's first thread, but a standing form, solid and ringing. 4 mana signatures braided into something the Academy had sworn only the founder's blood could build. The walls shook, the candle blew out, and the panel blazed. Class rank, SSS. The number came up clean and certain, and I stood there in the violet light and felt 9 years of being called worthless finally, quietly get buried. Lessons 168. Students 4. The discards of the Academy had just reached the rank it reserved for its own blood, in a back room that smelled of fish. The 4 of them dropped the form and stared at each other, breathing hard, and then, slowly, disbelieving, they started to laugh. Not the laugh of winners, the laugh of people who'd been told their whole lives that this exact thing was impossible, and had just watched it happen with their own eyes. We didn't hide it. That was the whole point. Seraphine arranged a public demonstration, an SSS rank combined casting, in the practice yard in front of the city, and the Academy could do nothing to stop it, because to stop it would be to admit the rank existed and that a discarded class had reached it. The 4 of them walked into the center of the yard, under the eyes of the whole city. The noble, the commoner, the foxkin, and the cast-off squire. And they cast together, and the form rose and held, clean and ringing, royal violet against the gray stone. The crowd was silent, and then the crowd was not. SSS rank, earned in public by the students the Academy had thrown away. The roar that went up from that yard ran through the city like the breaking of a dam, and I stood at the edge of it and thought, this is what they were afraid of, not our mana, the fact that we proved their whole order was a lie. The so what of an SSS rank wasn't money or fame, it was permission. The city had watched the Academy's discards reach its highest rank, and suddenly everything the Academy had ever said about talent and blood and worth was revealed as the machinery it had always been. The Beastkin Quarter marched, the commoners enrolled, the discarded came home. Reputation 94. Funds $188,300. The money was almost an afterthought, but it came anyway, because a city that has just learned the truth about its own gates opens them. Merchants, houses, even a few ashamed nobles, all of them suddenly eager to stand on the right side of history while the standing was cheap. And the Academy? The Academy went very, very quiet. Veil, suspended but not yet gone, watched from the shadows, and I knew that silence. It wasn't surrender. It was the pause before the last, most desperate move a cornered man ever makes. Seraphine moved, and moved fast. With an SSS rank class as proof of what real teaching could do, she had everything she needed to finish what the tribunal had started. The Academy's examination records were reopened, the rigged thresholds were documented, and the Crown, at last, began to move against the men who'd built the machine. The Crown will hold a formal inquiry, she told me, in that flat voice of hers, into the Academy's conduct, the exams, the forged letters, the bought testimony, all of it. She looked at me, and for the first time there was something almost like warmth in her gray eyes. You should be ready. They will not go quietly. I'd known men like Veil my whole life. They didn't go quietly. They went loudly, and they took everything they could with them. But the Crown was finally in the fight, and the city was finally awake, and for the first time in 9 years, I believed the good guys might actually have the numbers. Veil's last move came the night before the inquiry, and I only caught its shape because Ye Rin knew the halls he'd walk through. He gathered the men who still owed him, the bought officials, the noble debts, the 100 years of favors, and he set them one final task: discredit the teacher, and the class falls with him. They'll come at you with everything, Ye Rin said, and her voice was steady even though her eyes weren't. A forged confession, a bought witness, an accusation so ugly it doesn't matter if it's true, because the mud sticks. She'd seen her father do it. She knew the play. What do we do? I looked at my 4 students, the family I'd built out of the people everyone else threw away, and I gave her the only answer there was. We stand in the light, I said, and we let them break themselves on it. They can forge a record. They can't forge what this city has watched us become. I did the accounts one last time before the storm. Lessons 168. Students 4. Class rank SSS. Reputation, 94. Funds, $188,300. The class had climbed from a fish-smelling back room to the rank the Academy reserved for its own blood, and the panel in the corner of my eye was quiet and steady as a held breath. Tomorrow, the inquiry. Tomorrow, Vale's last gambit and the crown's final reckoning. I looked at the numbers and then out at the towers, and I thought about the man who'd called me worthless in front of the whole staff room, and about everything that had happened since. He'd thrown me away, and the system had caught me, and I'd built an army out of the people he'd thrown away too. Tomorrow he'd learn what that army could do. I blew out the candle and let the dark settle, and I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. End of chapter 13. The Crown's inquiry opened with the weight of a century behind it. The Academy's conduct, the rigged exams, the forged letters, the bought testimony, all of it was finally going to be read into the record in the light, and the city had turned out to watch the reckoning. Vale sat at the Academy's table with the composure of a man who'd prepared one last play. And then he played it. A witness was called, a shabby man I'd never seen, and he testified in a practiced voice that I'd taken money from a noble parent in exchange for a passing rank. The forged confession I'd been warned about, delivered on schedule. The room murmured, and I felt my students go rigid beside me. I watched Vale's face, and I saw the faintest, satisfied flicker, and I understood that this was the whole of his final gambit. One lie, one witness, one accusation ugly enough that the truth might drown in it. He'd spent 100 years learning that mud sticks. He was about to learn something about the people he'd thrown away. The witness told his story well. Dates, amounts, a meeting I'd supposedly had in a tavern I'd never entered. It was a good forgery, detailed enough to sound true, vague enough to be hard to disprove. The Crown's officials took notes, and I watched the lies spread through the room like ink and water. Seraphine's gray eyes never left the man, and I saw her doing the same thing I was, reading him. The way he glanced at Vale before answering, the rehearsed smoothness, the detail that slipped when the question surprised him. A bought witness is a performance, and a performance, under a good examiner's eye, always shows its seams. The accused may respond, Seraphine said at last, and the room turned to me. I stood, and I didn't rage. Rage is what they want. It looks like guilt. I've never met this man, I said. I've never taken a coin for a rank, and I have a student who remembers everything she has ever seen. Let her test the witness's memory. Mireille stood, and the room quieted. They knew her now, the commoner whose memory had already broken the Academy's ledger. She didn't accuse the witness. She just asked him, gently, to describe the tavern again, the color, the bartender, the exact words I'd supposedly said, and the witness, who'd rehearsed one version, began to contradict himself. It was beautiful to watch, in the way a slow dismantling is beautiful. Each question, a thread pulled. The tavern was red, then blue. The meeting was at noon, then dusk. The words changed, then changed again. By the end, the bought witness was sweating, and the room had seen exactly what he was. He's lying, Mireille said, flat and final. And I can prove it, because I remember the Academy's own records, the real ones, and the man he says paid us doesn't exist on any ledger in this city. She turned to the room. You've heard his story twice now. It isn't the same story. That's what a lie looks like when you make it tell itself again. The witness broke, and faster than Beck had. They paid me, he said, and his voice cracked, and he pointed a shaking finger at the Academy's table. They paid me to say it, the headmaster's men. I needed the money. I've got children. They said it would just be a few words. The room erupted. Vale rose, his composure finally gone, and Seraphine's gavel cracked like a gunshot, and the noise died. Sit down, she said to Vale, and the cold in her voice was the cold of a verdict already written. The witness has implicated your office in the subornation of perjury. This inquiry will hear him out. And it did. The shabby man, crying now, told the whole thing, who approached him, what they'd paid, how they'd coached him on the lie. The forged confession, the centerpiece of Val's final gambit, had just turned into the nail in his coffin. I watched it happen and felt the strangest thing, not triumph, relief, deep and quiet. Choi Min-sok was waiting at the shop when we got back, and I recognized the type before he spoke. The careful way a discarded man holds himself, braced for a door to close. 18 years old, and he said, "My father was a duelist. He testified against the academy's examiners once, and they ruined him for it. Now I hear there's a teacher who takes the ones they ruined." "Come in," I said, and that was all it took. He became the fifth. The panel ticked over, quiet and certain. "Students, 5. And I watched the class absorb him, the way it had absorbed Min-jae, with the wariness of the burned, and then, gradually, the fierce loyalty of people who'd been through the same fire. The academy's cruelty, I was learning, had a rhythm to it. It ruined a duelist's son for testifying, and the son grew up carrying the wound, and the wound walked across the city to a fishmonger's door and became a student. Every act of the academy's cruelty was, in the end, another recruit for the class it couldn't kill. The city rallied around the inquiry the way a tide comes in, slowly, then all at once. The Beastkin quarter marched, the commoners enrolled their children, the West Market hung our banner, and the East Quarter sang, and the Academy, for the first time in its history, found itself standing on the wrong side of its own city. Lessons 183. The panel climbed as I taught, because a teacher teaches even in the middle of a reckoning, and the line at the door kept growing. Reputation 97. The city had chosen, and it hadn't chosen the Academy. It had chosen the fishmonger's class, and the discards, and the truth. Funds, $276,400. The money was the least of it, but it came anyway, because a city that believes in you will fund you, and a class that stands in the light will never want for what it needs. I watched the ledger and the crowd and the banners, and I understood. This was what we'd been building toward, not a rank, a movement. The so what came the next day, when the royal board, the council of nobles and examiners that had overseen the academy for a century, was forced to formally recognize the class, not as a curiosity or a threat, but as an SSS rank academy of its own, with the crown seal on its charter. The discards written into the record. Seraphine handed me the charter herself, and there was the ghost of a smile on her severe face. "You built this," she said, "out of a fish shop and a system no one else could see. The crown does not usually find such things. It found yours." I took the charter and felt the weight of it, paper but heavier than stone. My students crowded around, and I watched them read their own names on the crown's parchment. The noble, the commoner, the foxkin, the squire, the duelist's son. The academy had spent 100 years writing them out of the record. Now the record was being written back. But the board was still the board, and the nobles were still the nobles, and I didn't mistake recognition for surrender. There were men in that hall who'd funded the rigged exams and bought the forged letters, and they were not going to simply accept a charter that ended their century of sorting. They'd fight it, quietly, the way they fought everything. Ye Rin read the room the way she'd been raised to. "They'll sign it," she murmured, "but they'll try to starve it. No funding, no facilities, no recognition where it counts. The charter is real, but a charter on paper doesn't fill a classroom." She was right, and she just handed me the next fight. "Then we build it ourselves," Nabi said, and her tale was high. "The way we built everything else." I looked at my 5 students and at the charter in my hand, and I understood that this was never going to be over. But for the first time, the fight was ours to define. The verdict came on the last day of the inquiry, and the room was so full the walls seemed to lean in. The crown read it out, the exams rigged, the letters forged, the testimony bought, and Headmaster Vale, architect of 100 years of the same, stripped of his office and exiled from the city in disgrace. Vale stood to hear it, and for a long moment he didn't move, and I watched the man who'd called me worthless in front of the whole staff room face the end of everything he'd built. Then his composure finally, completely broke, not into anger, but into a kind of dull bewilderment, as if he genuinely couldn't understand how the discards had won. "Worthless," he said, looking at me, and the word hung in the air. "That's what you were. That's what you all were." I met his eyes and said nothing, because the city was already saying it for me, in the banners, in the roar outside, in the names on the crown's charter. Worthless, it turned out, had just been the Academy's word for the people it was afraid of. I did the accounts on the last night of the inquiry, and the numbers told a story I still couldn't quite believe. Lessons 191, students 5, class rank SSS, Reputation, 97. Funds, $276,400. The worthless teacher, solvent and chartered and standing at the head of the strongest class in the city. Vale was gone, but the fight wasn't. The noble board still sat, the sorting still had its believers, and there were still students out there being told they were broken. The charter was a beginning, not an end. I looked at my 5 students and thought about the 6th and the 7th and the ones after. Tomorrow there'd be a final exam, the crown's own, impartial at last, to seal the rank the city had watched us earn. And after that, the real work. I closed the ledger and looked out at the towers, and I wasn't the man who'd walked out of the academy gate 9 years ago. That man was gone. In his place was something the academy had never once prepared for. End of chapter 14. The final exam was held in the Great Hall under the Crown's own seal, with a board of impartial examiners that Seraphine had assembled from beyond the Academy's reach. No rigged thresholds, no tapping fingers, no house coin. Just a test, fairly given, of everything the class had earned. The city had come to watch. My students walked in together, and the hall went quiet. The noble, the commoner, the foxkin, the cast-off squire, the duelist's ruined son, the discards the Academy had sworn could never rise, standing at the center of the very hall that had once thrown them out. I watched them from the edge and felt 9 years settle into something like peace. This is it, I'd told them that morning. Not to prove anything to them, to prove it to yourselves, that every lesson was real and every step was yours. They'd nodded, and I'd seen it in their faces. The fear was gone. In its place was something the Academy had spent 100 years trying to stamp out. Certainty. The 6th student found us before the exam, and he was the youngest of them all. 15, small for his age, wearing a street kid's patched clothes and carrying a cracked practice staff like it was the most precious thing he owned. My name's Oh Tae-yang, he said. I don't have anywhere. I want to be in your class. I looked at him, at the staff and the hunger in his eyes and the way he held himself like a thing used to being told no, and I saw every student I'd ever taught and every one I'd failed. Then watch today, I told him. Watch and learn, and after we'll talk about where you start. The panel ticked, quiet. Students, 6. He took a seat at the very back of the hall, and I watched him watch my students the way I'd once watched the academies, with the wide eyes of someone seeing, for the first time, what a door could open into. The class was 6 now. It was starting to feel less like a class and more like a beginning. There was nothing left to teach in the minutes before the exam, only to remind them of what they already were. I walked the line of my students, the family I'd built out of the people everyone else threw away, and I didn't give them a speech. I just looked at each of them, and they looked back, and that was enough. Lessons, 214. The panel sat at its final count, quiet and steady, and I understood what it had been recording all along. Not talent, not blood, not the Academy's sorting. Work. Real work, lesson by lesson, in a fish-smelling back room, until the numbers stopped mattering, and the truth they'd always pointed at stood up in the light. The first bell rang, and my students turned to the floor, and I stepped back to the edge and watched them go. Not with fear, but with the deep, quiet pride of a teacher who knows he's already done the part of the job that mattered. Whatever the board scored today, the class was already built. The exam tested what the Academy had always tested, and the class answered the way it had always answered, with the truth of their own work. Ye-Rin's clean channel, Mirei's perfect recall, Nabi's impossible speed, Min-jae's steady hand, Min-Sok's hard-won precision. One by one, they showed the city what real teaching built. Then the combined casting, the SSS form, 4 threads and then 5 braided into a standing structure that rang like a struck bell. The board's examiners leaned forward. The hall held its breath, and the form held, clean and certain, royal violet against the gray stone, while the impartial board wrote down what a century of the Academy's own examiners had spent a century refusing to see. When it was over, there was a silence, and then the hall rose, and I didn't hear the score over the noise. I didn't need to. I'd watched the form hold. The score was just the record of a thing that had already happened, the way the panel had always been, the shadow, never the light. The score, when the board read it, was the highest the Great Hall had recorded in a decade. Not a commoner's score marked down, not a beastkin score explained away, an SSS rank, written clean, under the crown seal, for a class of discards. The roar that went up nearly took the roof off. My students stood at the center of it, and I watched it land on each of them. Yerin's fierce vindication, Mirei's disbelieving joy, Nabi's high tail and bright eyes, Minjae's quiet tears, Minsok's stunned pride, and Taeyang at the back of the hall, on his feet, cheering with the rest. The Crown's own exam had just named the discarded class the strongest in the academy. Not by favor, not by blood, not by house coin, by the thing the academy had spent 100 years insisting didn't matter, by work. And the city had watched every second of it. The so what of it washed over the city like a wave. Reputation, 100. The academy's sorting was dead, not by decree, but by the simple, irreversible fact that its own city had watched the discards beat every rank it reserved for blood. The gates the academy had guarded for a century swung open, and the discarded came through. Funds, $412,800. The money was a tide now, because a charter and an SSS rank and the Crown's own seal together were worth more than any noble purse could withhold. The class wouldn't want for anything it needed to teach the next 100 discards, and the next and the next. I stood at the edge of the hall and watched my students be carried out on the shoulders of the crowd, and I thought about the alley where I'd found Yerin, and the loom where I'd found Mirei, and the quarter where I'd found Nabi, and I understood that the Academy's greatest fear had always been exactly this, that the worthless would realize they never were. They escorted Vale out through the east gate at dawn, and a crowd had gathered to watch him go. The man who'd called me worthless, who'd built the machinery that sorted a city into worthy and not, walked out through the very gate he'd once watched me leave, a fired teacher with a bag and a warm bun and nothing else. He saw me in the crowd, and for a moment our eyes met, and I saw it all flash across his face, the fury, the bewilderment, and underneath it, the thing he'd never once allowed himself to feel. Doubt. The first crack in 100 years of certainty that the world was a ladder, and he'd built the right side of it. I didn't gloat. I'd spent 9 years imagining this moment, and when it came, the only thing I felt was tired and free. Worthless, he'd called me. I looked at my students standing behind me, and at the city that had finally seen. No, I said, quiet enough that only he could hear. Just wasted, until now. The Crown formalized it that same week. The class was recognized as an accredited academy of its own, the first in the city's history chartered to a teacher with no house and no blood, teaching students with no rank and no name. Seraphine presented the final seal herself, and this time, the smile on her severe face was real. You did what the academy said was impossible, she said. Not with talent or blood or coin, but with work. The Crown does not forget such things. She looked at my students, and then back at me. What will you do now, Teacher Kang? It was the first time anyone in the city had ever called me by that title with respect. The same thing I did before, I said. Teach the ones everyone else throws away. There are more of them than there are of anyone else. Seraphine nodded once, and I saw that she understood. The fight wasn't over. It had just moved from the back room to the whole city, and there was room now for all of them. That night, back in the fish shop where it all began, I looked at my 6 students, the noble, the commoner, the foxkin, the squire, the duelist's son, and the orphan boy who'd shown up with a cracked staff, and I made them the only promise I'd ever been able to keep. This was never about rank, I told them. Rank was the cage they built to keep you out. You broke it. But there are 100 more cages out there, and 1,000 more students inside them, waiting for someone to look. I looked at each of them in turn. So we keep teaching, all of us, until there's no one left to throw away. Taeyang, the youngest, raised his cracked staff like it was a sword. Then I'll be next, he said, and the others laughed, and I saw the future of the thing we built right there in that fish-smelling back room. Not a class anymore, but a place where the discarded came to become what they'd always been, whole. I sat with the ledger one last time, and the numbers told the whole story in a single line. Lessons, 214. Students, 6. Class rank, SSS. Reputation, 100. Funds, $412,800. From a debt of $12,481 and a warm bun at the East Gate to this. The panel in the corner of my eye was quiet, the way it had always been. Not triumphant, just certain, recording the truth of the work the way it had from the first night in the dark. I looked at it and understood, at last, what it had been teaching me all along. The system didn't make anyone strong. It just finally let the work count. Somewhere in the city, a girl was sitting in an alley, or a boy at a loom, or a foxkin in a quarter the gates had kept shut, waiting for someone to look. I blew out the candle and stood up. 9 years ago, I'd walked out of the academy with nothing. Tomorrow, I'd walk back through the city with an army. End of chapter 15.